Hey guys, tonight we are taking a long, slow walk through Victorian London, and I want to warn you up front, you are going to need to leave your modern nose, your modern stomach, and most of your modern assumptions at the door. This is not the London of top hats and tea trays and gaslit romance you have seen in the period dramas. This is the actual London. The one where the wallpaper could kill you, the medicine could kill you, the water could kill you, and somehow an entire empire of 9 million people got up every morning, put on their itchiest garments, and went about their business as though absolutely none of that was worth mentioning. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Because it is genuinely lovely to picture this reaching every corner of the globe while you drift off. Now go ahead, dim the lights, put on a fan for that soft, forgettable hum, get yourself tucked in properly, and let's ease into this together. Before we step through the fog, let's sit with a few questions, the kind you have never had reason to ask before, but will not be able to stop thinking about once you have. Why would a respectable household hang wallpaper that was, quite literally, a slow-acting poison and hang it proudly? Why did people go to watch a man hang from a rope the way you might go watch a matinee? Packed lunch included? Why was getting dressed, if you were a wealthy woman, a physical ordeal requiring the assistance of another human being and roughly the structural engineering of a small bridge? Why did doctors hand out mercury and opium the way a modern pharmacist hands out cough drops? And why did nobody seem to notice the pattern of everyone who took it getting steadily? Mysteriously worse? Why did families keep a photograph of their dead relative propped up in a chair at the dining table and call it a keepsake rather than a horror film? And why, when the river running through the greatest city on earth turned into an open sewer thick enough to shame a swamp, did it take Parliament itself being driven out of its own building by the smell before anybody did a single thing about it? We are going to answer every single one of these tonight, slowly, thoroughly, and with considerably more detail than is strictly good for you this close to bedtime. Congratulations, you have just woken up in London, somewhere in the 1870s, in a city of nearly 4 million souls stacked on top of each other, in fog, coal smoke, and quiet, cheerful denial. The rich are dying of their own wallpaper. The poor are dying of their own water. Everybody in between is being sold opium for a headache and arsenic for a complexion, and not one of them thinks any of this is remarkable, because as far as they know, this is simply what Tuesday looks like. Let's find out exactly how normal it all felt, one horrifying, oddly charming detail at a time. Look around your sitting room for a moment, because the walls themselves are the star of tonight's first horror, and they are, by any reasonable modern standard, trying to kill you. That green is not just any green, it is the colour, the one every hostess in Britain wanted, a rich glowing emerald that made gaslight bounce around the room like something alive. Chemists called it Scheele's green, or later Paris green, or Schweinfurt green, depending on which factory cooked the batch, but the recipe underneath was always the same: copper mixed with arsenic, ground fine and bound into pigment. It went into wallpaper, yes, but also into curtains, carpets, ball gowns, artificial flowers pinned into hair, the wax of candles, and, on occasion, the dye used to tint sweets and jellies a festive shade of green. You are not living in a room that merely contains poison. You are living inside it, wrapped in it, practically upholstered in it. The fashionable classes did not think of green as dangerous. They thought of it as tasteful, modern, the colour of a household that had money and knew what to do with it. Which is why it is worth sitting with the fact that William Morris, the designer whose wallpaper patterns still turn up on tea towels and tote bags a century and a half later as a byword for cosy English good taste, had a family fortune tangled up in a Devon arsenic mine, even while his own firm printed those same lush greens onto paper for drawing rooms across the country. When people raised concerns, he was, shall we say, unenthusiastic about the theory that his product was hurting anyone, in roughly the way a modern executive might be unenthusiastic about a product recall memo landing on his desk the same week as a shareholder call. The trouble, as far as anyone could tell at the time, was not simply touching the paper. It was breathing the room. English houses in this period were notoriously damp, plaster walls sweating quietly behind the paper, and there was a working theory, later refined into the idea of a gas called trimethylarsine, sometimes nicknamed Gosio gas after the chemist who studied it, that damp and mould acting on the arsenical pigment could release an invisible vapour with a faint, musty, mousy smell into the air of a bedroom. You would not necessarily notice it as a smell so much as a mood, a room that always felt a little off, a little close. The kind of place you woke up in with a headache you could not explain. And people did wake up with headaches they could not explain. Chronic nausea, sore throats that would not clear, skin sores, a general lingering malaise that followed a household around for months. Doctors, working without the benefit of your knowledge of what was actually in the plaster, often reached for the nearest plausible diagnosis. And diphtheria was a popular guess, since it too produced a raw throat and a run-down constitution. And it had the advantage of being a disease doctors already knew how to write down on a certificate. Every so often, though, the pattern was too grim to file away as bad luck. In 1862, in Limehouse, a family lost several children in a house papered in that same brilliant green, and a Dr. Thomas Orton investigated closely enough to draw a straight line between the wallpaper and the deaths. One of the more thoroughly documented cases of a phenomenon that almost certainly killed people quietly, in ones and twos, in homes that never made the papers at all. The public did eventually start to find the whole business darkly funny, which is a very English way of being alarmed. The satirical magazine Punch ran cartoons mocking the arsenic waltz and arsenic green fashions, imagining skeletons in ball gowns and women literally dancing themselves into the grave for the sake of a flattering dress. It is in effect the Victorian equivalent of a viral thread mocking a beauty trend for containing a banned chemical. Except nobody pulled the product from shelves afterward, because that is the genuinely strange part. France restricted arsenical pigments. Parts of Germany did too. Britain, the country that had just spent decades legislating its way through sanitation, food and public health reforms, simply never got around to banning arsenic wallpaper outright. Manufacturers issued reassuring pamphlets. Doctors argued with each other in medical journals for 2 solid decades, and the wallpaper kept selling, because it was beautiful, and because nobody in power wanted to be the one to tell fashionable Britain that its favourite colour was a mistake. Which meant this was never really a poor person's problem. Cheap wallpaper existed, certainly, but the really saturated, expensive, richly pigmented greens, the ones that photographed well in a parlour and impressed the neighbours, were often the worst offenders, since more pigment meant more arsenic. If your house was the height of fashion, freshly redecorated, admired by everyone who visited, there was a real chance you were also the household most thoroughly marinating in a low, steady dose of poison, which is a fairly efficient way for a class system to organise its own suffering. The wallpaper was never the only place that shade of green turned up, and it was not even the most dangerous. The same Shields green pigment that gave your parlour its cheerful glow was routinely used to dye artificial flowers and the gauzy fabric called tarlatan, the stuff ball gowns were made of, so that a fashionable young woman could spend an entire evening dancing in a cloud of arsenic-laced net without anyone thinking twice. The women who actually made those artificial flowers, though, paid the real price. Working long hours in cramped London workshops, pinching and pasting petals by hand, they developed green-stained fingers, ulcerated skin, and hair that came out in clumps. An occupational hazard about as far from glamorous as it gets, considering what they were manufacturing. Spare a thought too for the tradesman who actually hung your wallpaper. He was not admiring it from an armchair across the room. He was cutting it, sanding it, and trimming it at close range, kicking up a fine haze of concentrated arsenic dust with every stroke. In some respects his exposure was worse than yours, since you merely lived beside the poison while he spent his working life breathing it in, an irony that seems to have occurred to approximately no one at the time. By the 1870s, enough bad press and public unease had accumulated that some manufacturers began quietly retiring their most dangerous greens, William Morris's own firm eventually among them, though Morris himself was in no rush, given that his family had financial ties to an arsenic mine. The change was gradual, patchy, and entirely voluntary, since Britain, unlike some of its continental neighbours, never actually got around to banning the stuff. Chemists of the day did eventually develop reliable methods for detecting arsenic in suspect wallpaper, dissolving scraps of pigment and running them through tests sensitive enough to reveal even a faint trace of the metal, and newspapers occasionally reported the results of these investigations with the sort of grim satisfaction reserved for a scandal everyone already suspected was true. Home testing kits marketed to worried housewives even appeared on the market, promising to let an ordinary family check their own drawing room for poison, the way you might now check a smoke alarm battery. An oddly practical response to a problem the government itself had declined to legislate away, leaving each anxious household to quietly police its own walls rather than waiting patiently on Parliament to ever get properly around to it. You can, of course, simply choose not to think about any of this and go back to admiring the wallpaper. Most Victorians did exactly that, right up until the headache set in. Sit down at the breakfast table, because nothing on it is quite what it claims to be, and the deception starts before you have even finished pouring your tea. Start with the milk, since it is the most innocent-looking item on the table, and therefore the most disappointing. The milkman's cart has, in all likelihood, made a small detour through a pump on the way to your door, because water is free and milk is not, and a splash added to the can stretches the morning's profit considerably. The trouble with watered milk is that it looks watered, thin and faintly blue rather than rich and white, so a pinch of chalk goes in to restore that appealing creamy colour. You are, in essence, drinking a dairy product with building material folded into it, and the milkman knows this, and quite possibly so do you, in the same resigned way a modern shopper suspects the olive oil labelled extra virgin has met a natural olive only in passing. The bread is not much better. A loaf of good white bread required good white flour, which cost money, so bakers with an eye on their margins bulked cheaper greyer flour with alum, a substance that whitened the loaf beautifully while doing your digestion no favours whatsoever, since it interferes with how your body absorbs what nutrition is left in the bread to begin with. In leaner or more unscrupulous establishments, the alum had company. Plaster of Paris or ground bone worked in to add bulk and weight, because bread was often sold by weight, and a heavier loaf was a more profitable loaf, regardless of what that extra weight was actually made of. Your tea, meanwhile, has had a previous life. Tea leaves that had already been steeped once at a hotel or a wealthier household were sometimes collected, dried out, and resold as fresh, occasionally stretched further with something the trade charmingly called smouch, a filler of dried ash leaves or sloe leaves, designed to look enough like tea leaves to pass a glance. To restore the right colour after this indignity, unscrupulous dealers sometimes brushed the leaves with dyes that were, to put it delicately, not intended for human consumption. If you fancy something green with your meal, tread carefully. Pickles and preserved peas were routinely given a boost of vivid, appetising green using copper sulfate, a compound more commonly associated with pest control than with lunch, added purely because customers expected their pickles to look a certain shade of garden fresh, and manufacturers were happy to manufacture that impression chemically rather than grow it honestly. Cheese rinds and certain sweets got a similar cosmetic touch-up from red lead, which did wonders for shelf appeal and rather less for the people eating it. Even your vinegar was not safe from tampering, since a splash of sulfuric acid was a cheap way to sharpen a batch that had gone weak. All of this was more or less an open secret. Consumers grumbled, grocers shrugged, and the whole arrangement rumbled along as a sort of unspoken national agreement that everyone was probably being cheated a little, all the time, in ways too diffuse and too slow-acting to really fight about, rather like a modern shrug at ultra-processed ingredient lists nobody can pronounce. Then, in 1858, the shrugging stopped, at least for a while. A Bradford confectioner's assistant was filling an order of peppermint humbugs for a street seller known locally as Humbug Billy, and the recipe, entirely illegally, called for a cheap bulking agent nicknamed Daft, essentially plaster of Paris, mixed in to stretch the sugar further. On this particular batch, through a mistake in the storeroom, arsenic trioxide went in instead. Around 20 people died, and roughly 200 more were poisoned from candy bought for children on an ordinary market day, which is the sort of detail that turns dark comedy back into simple horror rather quickly. It took a persistent doctor, Arthur Hill Hassel, running his own analytical investigations through the Lancet in the 1850s, actually putting these foods under a microscope and publishing exactly what was in them, to force the issue into Parliament. His work helped produce the Food Adulteration Act of 1860 and, later, the more effective Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, though enforcement in the years between remained patchy enough that a curious shopper could still, for some time, find a bit of copper in the pickles and a bit of chalk in the milk. Your beer fared no better than your bread. Brewers looking to stretch a batch, or to fake a bitterness they had not properly earned, sometimes reached for quassia wood or the aptly ominous berries known as Cocculus indicus, which happened to be genuinely toxic, and a splash of iron sulfate could be stirred in to lend a cheap pint the illusion of strength and clarity it did not possess. You raised your glass at the end of a long day expecting refreshment, and received, in effect, a small unlicensed chemistry experiment instead, and you drank it without complaint. Because what, precisely, was the alternative? Your morning coffee had its own quiet imposter problem. Genuine roasted coffee was frequently cut with, or replaced outright by, roasted ground chicory root, burnt acorns, or even roasted horse chestnuts, all ground fine enough to pass at a glance, and brewed dark enough to pass at a sip, sold to customers who had no reliable way of knowing the difference until the taste failed to quite match the smell. Even your mustard was not safe, commonly bulked out with plain wheat flour and touched up with turmeric to keep its colour convincingly bright despite the dilution. Punch and its fellow satirical papers found the whole situation richly comic, running jokes about the poor soul who might spend a lifetime searching Britain for a single meal that was honestly what its label claimed. A quest about as realistic as finding a landlord who fixes the radiator on the first ask. Every category of food, it turned out, had its own signature little fraud, quietly baked in, ground in, or stirred in long before it ever reached your table. And the truly strange part is how calmly everyone simply learned to live with it, the way you might learn to live with a landlord who never quite fixes the radiator. Enjoy your breakfast. It is at least filling in every sense of the word. Stand in front of your dressing table mirror for a moment, because the road to a fashionable complexion runs directly through a chemist's shelf of substances that would, today, require a hazmat suit rather than a powder puff. Consider the little box labelled something like Dr. Mackenzie's arsenical complexion wafers, sold not as a paste to smooth on, but as a sweet to eat, a dainty little tablet you swallowed like a mint on your way out the door. The logic, such as it was, held that arsenic taken internally would dilate the tiny capillaries just beneath the skin, producing a delicate translucent rosiness and a pale glow that reads, to modern eyes, uncomfortably close to the look of someone who is not entirely well, which of course you would not be, since you would be dosing yourself with poison on a regular schedule in pursuit of a good complexion. Your eyes need attention too. and for that there are belladonna drops extracted from deadly nightshade, applied directly to widen the pupils into that fashionable, doe-eyed, faintly startled look that painters and admirers found so appealing. What the drops actually deliver, alongside the wide pupils, is blurred vision, a painful sensitivity to light that makes a sunny afternoon feel like an assault, and, with repeated use, lasting damage to eyes that were only ever trying to look a little more romantic in candlelight. Then there is the matter of your skin tone generally, since a pale complexion signals leisure, money, a life spent indoors rather than labouring under the sun, while a tan reads as something closer to farm labour. To achieve that fashionable pallor, women reached for lead-based powders and paints, ceruse among them, brushed on to produce a flawless porcelain finish that, with sustained use, tends to eat away at the very skin it is meant to flatter, along with causing hair loss and the slow, cumulative poisoning that comes from wearing lead on your face for years at a stretch. Rouge offers you a small mercy, at least in one of its forms, since carmine, made from crushed cochineal insects, is unpleasant to think about but chemically harmless. Its rival on the shelf, a vermilion rouge built on mercury sulfide, is a different matter entirely, delivering its fashionable flush by way of a heavy metal that accumulates quietly in the body while you admire the colour in the mirror. Should grey hairs start creeping in, there are combs sold specifically to fix the problem, marketed as a simple grooming aid, run through the hair daily like any other comb, except that these ones are made partly of lead, engineered to leach the metal into the hair shaft with every stroke and darken grey strands back toward youth, one small toxic combing session at a time. None of this was sold in the shadows. These products carried respectable medical-sounding names, sat on chemists' shelves beside legitimate remedies, and were advertised with the same confident, faintly clinical language a modern face cream uses when it promises to brighten and renew, no asterisks, no fine print about capillary damage or heavy metal accumulation, just the calm assurance of a product doing exactly what a fashionable woman wanted it to do. The bitter joke sitting underneath all of it is that the entire routine was aimed at looking healthy, luminous, youthful, glowing with vitality, while quietly working against every one of those things from the inside out. The pale, wide-eyed, rosy-cheeked look so prized by Victorian society was, in a great many cases, simply what early heavy metal poisoning looked like on a fashionable woman, dressed up and given a flattering name. Your hair was not exempt from all this either. Certain dyes marketed to banish grey relied on silver nitrate, which could leave the scalp and skin blotched and irritated with repeated use, a curious trade of one cosmetic complaint for another. Meanwhile, for the fashionable woman troubled by freckles or a blemish or two, there were arsenic-based soaps to be rubbed directly onto the face, on the theory, apparently, that if a little arsenic brightened the wallpaper, a little more surely could not hurt the complexion. Then there was Bloom of Youth, a popular skin-whitening lotion that achieved its pale, luminous effect the old-fashioned way, with lead, essentially delivering the same hazard as lead-based face powder in a more elegant, pourable bottle. Doctors were not entirely silent on the matter. Warnings about arsenic soaps and lead lotions did appear in medical journals and occasionally in the general press across the middle decades of the century, yet a stern paragraph buried in a journal was never much of a match for a glowing endorsement printed beside an advertisement in a ladies' magazine, and the products kept selling regardless. Women without the money for fashionable poison found their own workarounds and stumbled, quite by accident, onto something safer. A pinch of beetroot juice rubbed into the cheeks supplied colour, plain flour dusted over the face supplied pallor, and neither one required a warning label, a small irony the wealthier ladies buying Bloom of Youth would have appreciated, had they known. You finish your toilet, step back from the mirror, and admire the effect. It really is a lovely glow. Shame about what is producing it. Feel a little unwell tonight, and your doctor has exactly one instinct: reach for the same heavy silvery metal that thermometers are made of and have you swallow it. The workhorse of the Victorian medicine cabinet is calomel mercurous chloride, prescribed as a purgative for nearly anything that ails you: a fever, an upset stomach, a liver your doctor has decided is sluggish, a general sense of being under the weather. It is not a fringe remedy administered by a suspicious apothecary in a back room. It is mainstream, respectable medicine, dispensed by the most reputable physicians in the country with total confidence. The way a modern doctor might reach for paracetamol without a second thought. For anything that feels a bit more serious, there is blue mass, sometimes called blue pill, a small dose of mercury rolled together with licorice and rose honey to make it more palatable. Prescribed for depression, toothache, the pains of childbirth, tuberculosis, and syphilis alike. A single remedy pressed into service for problems that have almost nothing in common with one another, except that the doctor is out of better ideas. For syphilis specifically, mercury ointments are also rubbed straight onto the skin, a treatment grim enough to have produced its own bit of dark folk wisdom at the time. The observation that a night with Venus led to a lifetime with Mercury. Here is the part that should keep you up at night, in the least soothing way possible. Doctors are watching for excessive drooling and loosening teeth as proof that the mercury dose is working, a sign of therapeutic success rather than what it plainly is, which is textbook mercury poisoning. Imagine a modern doctor telling you your teeth coming loose is a good sign, the treatment doing exactly what it should, and you begin to understand how confidently wrong an entire respected profession can be, while still charging by the visit. The metal follows people well beyond the sick room. In towns like Stockport, mercury nitrate was used in the felt hat making trade, and hatters who worked with it day after day developed tremors, slurred speech, and a creeping confusion that came to be known locally as hatters' shakes, which is where the phrase mad as a hatter actually comes from, a bit of everyday slang describing an occupational disease so common it needed its own nickname. Even babies are not spared. Teething powders sold under trusted names such as Steedman's sometimes contained mercury compounds in the form of calomel, marketed as a gentle remedy for a fussy infant. And in some children this exposure produced a condition later recognised as acrodynia, or pink disease, marked by swelling and a strange pink discoloration of the hands and feet along with a general inconsolable misery that no amount of soothing could touch, since the soothing itself was the cause. What is remarkable is not that mercury was dangerous, plenty of Victorians eventually suspected as much, but how completely unremarkable its use was in daily medical practice, dispensed by serious men in serious offices to patients of every class. From the aristocrat with a headache to the infant with a new tooth coming in, all treated with the same silvery metal, all told with a straight face that this was simply how medicine worked. For the truly committed case of syphilis, pills and ointments were sometimes only the beginning. Patients could be sealed into a specially built steam cabinet or fumigation box for a mercury vapour bath, sitting enclosed while the vapour worked its way in through skin and lungs at once. A contraption that, described plainly, sounds considerably less like a medical treatment and rather more like something you would be sentenced to. Nor were children spared. Worm lozenges, sold to clear out the intestinal parasites so common among Victorian youngsters, sometimes contained mercury compounds of their own, dosed out to small bodies with exactly the same breezy confidence adults applied to their own calomel. And the reach extended further still, into asylums where mercury-based treatments were administered to patients struggling with their mental health. A fact that says less about syphilis specifically, and rather more about how thoroughly this one silvery metal had worked its way into nearly every corner of Victorian medicine. It took the slow, unglamorous rise of germ theory, and a medical profession gradually learning to demand actual evidence before reaching for a remedy, to finally loosen mercury's grip on the profession in the later decades of the century. For the patients who had already lost teeth, hair, and the steady use of their own hands and nerves along the way, that shift arrived several decades and several dosages too late. You take your dose, thank the doctor, and go home to lie down, which, given what you have just swallowed, is genuinely the best advice anyone has given you all day. Listen for a moment to the eerie hush of a Victorian nursery, because the silence you are hearing is not contentment. It is the product of a chemist's bottle doing exactly what it was designed to do. That quiet did not arrive by accident, and it did not much care what class of household you were born into. Down at the chemist's counter, sitting in plain view beside the cough drops and the hair tonics, are bottles of Godfrey's cordial, an opium tincture sweetened with treacle to make it go down easily, alongside branded rivals like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, advertised with cheerful slogans practically implying that babies asked for the stuff by name, when in fact the bottle contained a mixture of morphine, opium, and alcohol. Steedman's soothing powders round out the shelf. None of it requires a prescription. Any parent, nursemaid, or worried grandmother can simply walk in and buy it. The way you might pick up a bottle of infant fever reducer today, except with considerably more kick. It would be easy to imagine this as strictly a story of exhausted factory mothers reaching for anything that would buy them a few hours of peace. And that story is real. But it is not the whole picture, and it is worth setting it aside for a moment to look at the nursery at the other end of the social scale. The wealthy household with its own dedicated nursery wing and a nanny hired specifically to keep the children content. That nanny wants an undisturbed night just as badly as any overworked mother in a tenement, because a wailing infant reflects directly on her competence, and a nursery known for its screaming babies is a nursery at risk of losing its staff their positions. The soothing syrup sitting on the nursery shelf, then, is not desperation. It is simply good household management, quietly and routinely used to keep a well-off baby, and by extension a well-off household, calm and presentable. Teething itself is treated less like a normal stage of infant development, and more like an ailment requiring active medical intervention. A fussy baby with swollen gums might be brought to a doctor who lances the gums with a small blade to help the tooth along, a procedure that sounds considerably more alarming than any teething syrup. Babies are also handed hard objects to gnaw on. Coral teething rings among the fashionable choices, silver teething sticks for those who could afford the extra shine, and in some households a caregiver rubs a bit of gin or whiskey straight onto the sore gums, on the reasonable sounding theory that if it makes an adult feel better, it will do the same for an infant. Around many of these same babies hangs a little string of amber beads, an amber teething necklace worn on the folk belief that the warmth of the skin draws some soothing resin out of the stone and into the child. It does nothing at all, medically speaking, but it costs little, it looks sweet in a family portrait, and it gives everyone involved the comforting sense that something is being done, which is, in its own quiet way, exactly what half of Victorian nursery care amounted to. The soothing syrups themselves carried a real and serious risk that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with quality control. Dosage varied wildly from bottle to bottle and from retailer to retailer, since nobody was standardising how much opium went into a given batch, and a nursemaid measuring out what she believed to be a safe, familiar spoonful could just as easily be measuring out a fatal one. When infants died from this, the death was often recorded simply as found dead in bed, a phrase that closed the file without ever asking what exactly had been poured into the child the night before. None of this belonged to one class or one desperate corner of society. It was simply how an entire country got its babies to sleep. From the crowded tenement to the nursery with the good rugs, a shared national lullaby with opium quietly stirred into the treacle. Not all of that opium came from far away. England grew a fair amount of it at home, particularly across the low waterlogged fenland stretching through Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, where poppy cultivation had taken hold and opium use was, for the local population, nothing unusual or scandalous at all. In these fen villages, opium eating was simply woven into ordinary adult life, taken as a defence against the aches, chills, and recurring fevers that the damp, malarial marsh air brought with it. It was sold openly at the local shop or market stall, displayed and purchased with the same unremarkable ease as tea or tobacco, no whispered request or furtive glance required. Workhouse infirmaries leaned on opiates just as readily, dosing restless, distressed, or difficult patients into a more manageable quiet. A settled patient made for a settled ward, and an attendant stretched thin across a room full of the sick, and the destitute had every practical reason to reach for the bottle, rather than spend an hour they did not have offering comfort instead. The habit, then, was never confined to the nursery at all. It threaded through the whole of Victorian life, cradle to workhouse cot, quietly propping up an exhausted, overstretched society one dose at a time. The nursery is finally silent, the baby is finally still, and everyone downstairs agrees what a good, easy child you have. They are not entirely wrong. They are just not asking why. Take a walk along the Thames embankment on a hot July afternoon if you can bear it, because the river carrying London's drinking water is also carrying, quite literally, everything London no longer wants. The colour alone should concern you. It is not so much a river as a slow brown ribbon of sludge, thick enough in places to catch and hold whatever floats past. Dead dogs, dead cats, the occasional bloated something you decide not to look at too closely, all bobbing gently along past the finest buildings in the empire. The smell arrives before the view does, a solid wall of rot and ammonia that seems to physically press against your face, and you understand within seconds why people are pressing handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or cologne to their noses as they hurry past, as though a hanky were ever going to be a match for this. The cause is, in its own grim way, a story of progress outrunning plumbing. Middle-class London has spent the last few decades enthusiastically installing flush water closets, delighted with this marvellous new convenience that whisks waste away with a satisfying gurgle, never quite pausing to ask where a way actually leads. The answer, it turns out, is that the same cesspits that used to handle this modestly are now overwhelmed, so the overflow, and increasingly the whole business, gets routed straight into the Thames, the very river the city also draws its drinking water from. It is roughly the modern equivalent of connecting your toilet directly to your kitchen tap in trusting distance to sort out the details. The summer of 1858 is when this arrangement finally announces itself to everyone, because it happens to be an unusually hot one, and heat does to a sewage-choked river exactly what you would expect it to do to anything else left out in the sun too long. The smell concentrates, intensifies, and refuses to be ignored, earning the whole miserable event the nickname the Great Stink, a phrase almost too polite for what is actually occurring. The truly delicious irony is where Parliament happens to sit. The Houses of Parliament are built right on the riverbank, practically leaning over the water, which means the men responsible for governing the empire are also, for one uncomfortable summer, the men most directly and personally marinating in its sewage. You would like to imagine some grand epiphany about public health prompted this crisis into action, but mostly it seems to have been that important people were finally, personally, unbearably uncomfortable, which has always been a far more reliable engine of government action than the suffering of people without a vote. Their first response, tellingly, is not engineering, but interior decorating. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament are soaked in chloride of lime, a disinfectant, in a doomed attempt to mask the odour drifting in through the windows, which is a bit like trying to cover a bonfire with a bedsheet. It does not work. MPs, gagging through their own sittings, seriously float the idea of relocating Parliament entirely, upstream or out of London altogether. Rather than fix the river itself, the Victorian equivalent of a company moving offices, instead of addressing why the office smells like that in the first place. It is worth sitting with the fact that the poor of London had been breathing some version of this smell, diluted but ever present, for decades without prompting so much as a parliamentary debate. It took the specific discomfort of the aristocracy wafting up through Gothic windows to convert a public health catastrophe into an urgent national priority. The river did not get worse for the poor that summer so much as it finally got personal for the people who could actually do something about it. What they believed was making them sick, incidentally, was not germs. Nobody in the chamber has any working concept of germ theory yet, but the smell itself. The dominant medical theory of the day is miasma, the idea that foul air is the disease, that cholera and fever travel on bad odours the way a cold travels on a draught. So the entire multi-million-pound engineering response that follows is motivated, officially, by a desire to get rid of the stink rather than any understanding of what was actually killing people. They were right for entirely the wrong reasons, which may be the most Victorian sentence imaginable. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer commissioned by the Metropolitan Board of Works to solve this once and for all, and to his enormous credit, he does not think small. His plan is not a patch job on the existing pipes, but an entirely new circulatory system for the city, a network of enormous interceptor sewers designed to catch the waste before it ever reaches the central Thames and carry it far downstream instead, out of sight and, crucially, out of nose. Construction runs roughly from 1859 to 1875, an undertaking so vast it eventually totals over 1,300 miles of sewer tunnel beneath London, an infrastructure project on a scale the city had genuinely never attempted before. And because this is Victorian England, even the plumbing gets dressed up for the occasion. The great pumping stations built at Abbey Mills and Crossness are ornamented like cathedrals, all wrought iron and polychrome brickwork and soaring ceilings, easily the most beautiful buildings ever constructed for the express purpose of moving sewage. Nobody needed a pumping station to look like a place of worship. They built one anyway. The happiest accident in this entire saga is that fixing the smell also, almost incidentally, fixed the disease. Nobody involved understood that cholera spread through contaminated water rather than bad air. Yet by rerouting the sewage away from the drinking supply, Bazalgette's network dramatically reduced cholera outbreaks in the city anyway, a public health triumph achieved by people chasing entirely the wrong theory and stumbling into the right solution. Before Bazalgette got anywhere near a shovel, the official response was, essentially, to throw perfume at the problem. Cart after cart of chloride of lime, a harsh disinfecting powder, got tipped straight into the Thames in industrial quantities, the civic equivalent of lighting a candle in a room where something has died behind the wall. You could stand on a bridge and watch men shovel it in by the sackful, all in the sincere belief that if the smell could just be chemically overpowered, the sewage feeding it could stay exactly where it was. It did not work, obviously, because you cannot disinfect a river the size of the Thames one wagon load at a time. But it bought a few weeks of official looking activity, which in parliamentary terms often passes for a solution in itself. While the gentlemen upstairs held handkerchiefs to their faces, entire families were working the riverbank for a living. At low tide, when the Thames pulled back to reveal its glistening, reeking mudflats, so-called mudlarks, children as often as adults, waded in barefoot and combed the sludge by hand for anything worth a few pence. Coal dropped from barges, scraps of rope, bits of metal or bone, whatever the river had swallowed and reluctantly given back. This was not a metaphor for poverty, it was poverty, conducted for hours a day in direct, skin-level contact with the same effluent that had Parliament reaching for scented handkerchiefs a few miles upstream. Nobody handed them protective clothing or a wage for it. The mud itself was the entire economy. Even once Bazalgette had his plan drawn up, plenty of respectable medical opinion thought he was solving the wrong problem entirely. The dominant theory of disease held that illness travelled through miasma, bad-smelling air itself, rather than through contaminated water, which meant that to a genuine believer, spending a fortune on sewers looked like an expensive misunderstanding, akin to rewiring a house to fix a leaky roof. Certain officials openly doubted whether the whole underground network was worth the cost, insisting the real danger was the odour, not whatever the odour happened to be sitting in. It took years of falling death rates before the sceptics were quietly, grudgingly proven wrong, and by then, Bazalgette's sewers were already running under half of London, regardless of who had believed in them. Satirical magazines had a field day with the whole crisis, and Punch published a memorable cartoon imagining a skeletal cloaked figure of Death himself rowing a small boat across the filthy river, ferrying disease to the city the way a waterman might ferry passengers. A grim little joke that captured public frustration far more effectively than any parliamentary speech had managed. The image stuck in the popular imagination precisely because it did not feel like exaggeration. Anyone who had stood on a bridge that summer and breathed in the smell would have told you the cartoonist was, if anything, being generous. So the next time your thermostat clicks on a few degrees too warm and you consider it an inconvenience worth complaining about, spare a thought for a parliament that had to be personally, nostril-deep marinated in its own sewage before it would spend a shilling fixing a problem the rest of the city had been living in for a generation. Wait for the ladies to leave the dining room after dinner, because what happens next among the gentlemen is a piece of furniture and a ritual that would mortify absolutely everyone at your own dinner table. The evening, up to this point, has been the picture of refinement. Candlelight catching the crystal, the soft clink of silver against china, conversation kept carefully within the bounds of good taste. Then, on cue, the lady of the house rises, the other women follow her lead, and they withdraw to the drawing room for tea and talk that does not require the presence of men, leaving the gentleman behind with the port decanter, a box of cigars, and the unhurried expectation that this particular phase of the evening is going to last quite a while. And a while in this context means hours. Port is not a drink you rush, and Victorian gentlemen treat this after-dinner session as a genuine institution, a slow orbit of pouring, passing, toasting and talking politics or business or nothing at all. The trouble, as any modern person could have predicted, is that a few hours of steady drinking eventually creates a rather pressing logistical problem, and here is where the evening takes its unexpectedly practical turn. In some households, the solution to this problem is kept discreetly nearby the entire time, a chamber pot tucked into a cupboard, a sideboard or a screened corner of the dining room itself, positioned there specifically so that no gentleman need abandon the port, the cigars, or the conversation simply because nature has made a request. When the moment arrives, he simply steps behind the screen or into the little alcove provided, attends to business, and returns to his seat within the minute, resuming his sentence more or less where he left off. What should strike you here is not the existence of the object so much as the complete absence of drama around it. Nobody excuses themselves nervously. Nobody pretends to check on the horses. There is no elaborate cover story, because none is needed. Everyone at that table understands exactly what the screen is for, and regards it with the same mild indifference you might show a coat rack. It is simply understood as a practical convenience for a very long evening, filed under good manners rather than anything remotely scandalous. Sit with that for a moment, because it is genuinely a lot to sit with. This is the same social class obsessed with propriety down to the correct fork for the fish course. The same people who consider it improper to mention a woman's ankle in polite company, calmly tolerating an actual toilet a few feet from where they are eating. Etiquette, it turns out, is not a fixed moral law, but an enormously specific and somewhat arbitrary set of local customs, and this is one that simply never made it onto anyone's list of things to be embarrassed about. It helps, of course, that this entire ritual belongs exclusively to a household wealthy enough to own a dedicated dining room, a sideboard, and a servant to empty the pot afterward without comment. Step outside that world, and the picture changes completely, because for the working poor of London, indoor sanitation of any kind remains a genuine luxury rather than a household fixture. Many working-class families and entire tenement courts shared a single outdoor privy between several households. A communal arrangement that meant queuing, that meant walking outside in whatever weather London decided to provide that week, and that meant a level of exposure and indignity the gentleman upstairs never had to contemplate mid-port. In poorer and rural areas, these privies were frequently simple pits, or what were called earth closets, which used ash or dry earth rather than water to cover waste rather than flushing it away, a system with a certain rustic logic to it, but not one you would call pleasant at 2 a.m. in January. Piped sewer connections and proper water closets did eventually spread through London, but unevenly and slowly, arriving in wealthy neighbourhoods first, and trickling down the social ladder over decades, so that for a long stretch of the Victorian era, your access to a decent toilet was determined less by the century you lived in than by the street. And where the system broke down entirely, older and cruder solutions persisted. Night soil men were still employed in some areas to do the job by hand, physically collecting waste from cesspits and carting it away, and they generally did this work at night, which is precisely where the job gets its name, a small, dark detail that tells you almost everything about how this labour was regarded by the people who never had to think about it. Nobody at a Victorian table would ever have named the chamber pot for what it was. The entire arrangement survived on a fog of polite substitution. A guest did not use it, they stepped out for a moment, or attended to necessary business, or excused themselves briefly, phrases vague enough that a visitor unfamiliar with English customs could sit through an entire dinner without ever quite grasping what was happening in the corner. This was euphemism as a load-bearing structure, not decoration. The vagueness itself was the manners. Say the plain word, and you had committed a far worse social error than the act you were describing. Everyone in the room understood exactly what was going on, of course. The point was never secrecy, only the shared performance of not noticing, which somehow required more effort than simply acknowledging the pot would have. Victorian manufacturers, never ones to waste an opportunity for a joke nobody could laugh at out loud, sometimes painted the inside bottom of a chamber pot with a small image, a caricature of an unpopular politician perhaps, or a grinning frog, positioned so it was only ever revealed at the precise moment of use. It was a private punchline delivered to an audience of exactly one, seen by its owner alone and never mentioned to another living soul, a bit of absurdist humour smuggled into the single most unglamorous object in the house. Somewhere between the crystal glassware and the 7-course menu sat this small, deliberately hidden joke, proof that even a culture this devoted to decorum could not entirely resist being a little ridiculous about it, provided the ridiculousness stayed safely out of sight. The convenience was not reserved for men either, whatever the dining room might have implied. Some households kept a small retiring room just off the drawing room, stocked with a comparable arrangement, so that women who withdrew from the table after dinner, ostensibly to leave the men to their port and cigars, could quietly attend to the same business the chamber pot handled downstairs. Nothing about this required comment upon their return. The withdrawal itself was already an accepted ritual, and what happened during it stayed unspoken by design. So here is your Victorian dinner party in full, candlelight, crystal, a 7-course meal served with immaculate ceremony, and a chamber pot standing sentry in the corner, tolerated by everyone in the room as simply part of good breeding, while a few streets over, an entire family waits its turn at a shared outdoor privy in the cold. Manners, it seems, were always more concerned with which fork you used than with what happened after dinner. Walk down almost any street in the poorer half of the city after dark, because roughly one building in every 4 or 5 you pass is a place explicitly designed to get you extraordinarily, catastrophically drunk on the cheapest spirit money can buy. This is not a new problem London stumbled into recently. The city has a long and well-documented relationship with gin stretching back to the notorious gin craze of the previous century. The one famously captured in Hogarth's engraving Gin Lane, all skeletal figures and collapsing buildings, and a mother so far gone she drops her own baby down a stairwell without noticing. That image was already meant as a warning generations ago, and yet here you are, decades later, walking past its living descendant on nearly every corner. What has changed by the Victorian period is mostly the packaging. Gin is no longer sold from grim little stalls, but from what are called gin palaces, and the word palace is doing real work in that phrase. These places are lit by gas, a genuine novelty that makes them glow against the darkness of the surrounding street. Their windows full of polished brass fittings, etched and mirrored glass, and rich mahogany fittings that catch and multiply every flicker of light. Walking past one at night, half lit and glittering, is a bit like passing a 5-star hotel lobby dropped into the middle of a slum, and that contrast is entirely intentional. The exterior promises glamour precisely because everything else on the street promises none. Step inside, and the glamour is really only a delivery mechanism. The gin itself, often the cheap variety known as Old Tom, is priced low enough that a labourer can afford it on wages that would never stretch to a doctor's visit or a decent meal. Which is precisely the point. For a great many people, a glass of gin functions as a painkiller for a bad tooth, a warming breakfast on a freezing morning, or simply the fastest and cheapest route from feeling miserable to feeling, briefly, considerably less so. Judged purely as a consumer product, it is remarkably efficient. Judged as anything else, it is a disaster with excellent lighting. Women in particular turned to gin as a kind of self-medication against a life that offered very few other outlets for despair. So much so that the drink earned itself the grim nickname Mother's Ruin, a phrase that manages to be both a joke and an entire social history in 3 words. Behind that nickname sits a genuine wave of domestic collapse, children going unfed, wages disappearing before rent got paid, violence that nobody outside the family was in any position to stop. It is worth pausing on the sheer density of the thing, because this is not a handful of disreputable dens tucked down back alleys. In the poorer districts, drinking establishments of one kind or another can make up something like a fifth or a quarter of the buildings on a given street. An astonishing concentration of an industry whose entire business model depends on your unhappiness. Imagine a modern high street where every 4th or 5th shopfront was a payday lender lit up like a nightclub, and you begin to get the shape of it. Naturally, all of this produced a backlash, because a society cannot watch this much public drunkenness, this many ruined households, without someone organising a movement against it. The temperance movement grew directly out of scenes like the one you are walking through, and it built real institutions to fight back, pledge societies where members formally swore off drink entirely, and organisations like the Band of Hope, founded in 1847, which took the fight directly to children, encouraging them to sign lifelong pledges of total abstinence before they were even old enough to be tempted. There is something almost touchingly desperate about that strategy, catching children early because the adults were so thoroughly lost to it already. But it also tells you how seriously reformers took the scale of the problem. This was not moral panic over the odd tipple. This was an entire underclass essentially anaesthetising itself nightly, one gaslit palace at a time, because sobriety offered no particular advantage in a life that gin, however briefly, made bearable. Part of what made gin so devastatingly effective was the sheer scale of accessibility built into how it was sold. Publicans measured it out in gills, minuscule portions cheap enough that a single penny could buy a mouthful strong enough to dull an entire day of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. This was not an accident of pricing, it was the business model. You did not need savings or a steady wage to get drunk, you needed one coin. which meant gin was, in practical terms, available to absolutely everyone at the exact moment they had nothing else. The gin palaces themselves understood, with a clarity that would not look out of place in a modern marketing meeting, that the person pouring the drink mattered almost as much as the drink itself. Publicans routinely hired young, attractive women to work the counter, correctly calculating that a warm, glamorous face behind all that brass and gaslight kept customers coming back far more reliably than the gin alone ever could. It was hospitality with a commercial spine, charm deployed as a retention strategy roughly a century before anyone in an office would think to call it that. Even at the time, the contrast was not lost on everyone. The same artist responsible for the grim, skeletal scenes of Gin Lane also produced a companion piece called Beer Street, depicting plump, contented, hard-working citizens enjoying good English ale instead, robust rather than ruinous. It was not subtle. The message was closer to a public health poster than a painting, an argument that if the nation insisted on drinking, it should at least drink something the artist considered wholesome and patriotic rather than foreign and destructive. Look again at that glittering shop front, all brass and mirror and warm gaslight spilling onto the pavement, and recognise it for what it actually is, an entire industry that figured out, well over a century before anyone coined the term, exactly how to make despair look like a night out. Imagine, for a moment, being so destitute that your only remaining option is a building deliberately built to be worse than poverty itself, because that is precisely what the Victorian workhouse was engineered to achieve. The system traces back to the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a piece of legislation built on a principle with the coldly bureaucratic name of less eligibility. The idea, stripped of its polite phrasing, is simple. Conditions inside the workhouse must be worse than the conditions of the very worst paid labourer still scraping by outside its walls. Not equal, not merely unpleasant. Actively worse, on purpose, so that nobody would ever choose the workhouse over even the most miserable independent existence unless every other option had truly run out. You arrive then not as a guest of the parish's mercy but as a problem to be processed, and the processing begins immediately with separation. Husbands are split from wives, parents from children, sorted by sex and age into different wings, as though a family were a liability to be diffused rather than a unit to be preserved. Whatever clothes you arrived in are taken away and replaced with the uniform workhouse dress, a garment with all the warmth and personality of a receipt, ensuring that whoever you were on the outside is thoroughly erased before you are given a bed. The work itself is where the system's philosophy becomes almost sculptural in its cruelty. Take oakum picking, one of the standard tasks assigned to inmates, which involves unravelling old, tar-stiffened ship's rope back into loose fibres by hand, a job that shreds fingertips raw over hours of repetition and produces a small pile of fibre whose economic value is almost beside the point. Stone breaking serves a similarly hollow function. These are not efficient tasks chosen because the parish desperately needs oakum or gravel. They are chosen because they are grinding, repetitive, and physically punishing, which was, quite literally, the entire design brief. Meals follow the same logic of calculated minimalism. Official dietary tables specify exactly what an inmate receives, and the answer is almost always some combination of gruel, bread, cheese, and the occasional thin broth, portioned out with the precision of a chemistry experiment and the warmth of a parking ticket. Nobody eating this food was meant to feel nourished. They were meant to feel that they had reached the very edge of what a human body could be given and still function, and to feel it 3 times a day. This is, of course, precisely the image immortalised in Oliver Twist, and it is worth remembering that the famous scene of the starving boy stepping forward to ask for more gruel was not satirical exaggeration so much as recognisable reporting. The line, "Please sir, I want some more," lands so well because everyone reading it at the time understood exactly which institution, and exactly which bowl it was describing. The stigma attached to entering this system ran so deep that it functioned almost as effectively as the bad food and the broken families in keeping people away. Going on the parish, as it was known, carried a shame so heavy that elderly people, the sick and the genuinely desperate would frequently endure appalling conditions on the outside rather than submit to the workhouse, sometimes holding out until they were within days of death before finally, reluctantly, walking through its doors. There is a particular bitterness worth sitting with here, because this entire apparatus was administered, funded and publicly described as charity. It appears in official records as poor relief, a system of care for the destitute, a civilised society's answer to the question of what to do with its most vulnerable members. And yet, at every single level of its design, from the separated families to the shredded fingers to the rationed gruel, its actual engineering goal was to make sure as few people as possible ever asked for that care in the first place. Children born or raised inside the system were not simply left idle. They were sent to a workhouse school and underfunded, joyless institution that taught just enough reading and arithmetic to make a child minimally useful without ever threatening to lift them out of the class they had been born into. The curriculum was less an education than a holding pattern, preparing its students for exactly the low-wage labour their parents had already failed to escape. Daily life inside any given workhouse depended enormously on one factor that had nothing to do with policy: the personal character of whoever happened to be running it. The workhouse master and matron held near total, largely unsupervised authority over everyone inside, deciding rations, punishments and privileges with little meaningful oversight from the parish officials nominally above them. A strict but fair master could make the place merely miserable. A cruel one could make it something closer to a nightmare, and inmates had no say in which version of the institution they had been born into. Occasionally the neglect became too extreme to bury quietly, as at the Andover workhouse in the mid-1840s, where a parliamentary investigation found that inmates set to crushing old animal bones for fertiliser had grown so hungry they were gnawing the bones themselves for scraps of marrow and gristle. The revelation was scandalous enough to briefly embarrass the entire system into promises of reform. And through all of it, inmates were still required to attend religious worship on a fixed schedule. Regardless of their personal beliefs, one more small non-negotiable claim the institution made on lives it already controlled almost completely. It is, in other words, a welfare system built by people who resented the idea of welfare, dressed up in the language of compassion and administered with the precision of a punishment. Consider that the next time someone tells you bureaucracy has never been creative. Picture a child not yet 10 years old crawling on hands and knees through a space barely wider than a chimney flue. Because for a significant portion of Victorian England, that child's tiny size is not a vulnerability, it is a marketable qualification. Start with the climbing boys, the small children, sometimes barely 5 or 6 years old in earlier decades, sent scrambling up narrow chimney flues to sweep away soot with a brush. They are often stripped down for the job, sometimes made to climb barefoot or entirely naked, simply so that no loose clothing snags on brick and traps them halfway up a shaft, using elbows and knees to inch upward through a space that would make most adults claustrophobic just reading about it. Some of these children became genuinely stuck, wedged into a narrowing flue with no way forward and no way back, and did not survive the experience. Below them, the adult sweep sometimes had his own methods of motivation, lighting small fires to encourage a faster climb, or pricking bare feet with pins, treating the child less as an apprentice than as a tool that occasionally needed prodding. You might reasonably assume laws had already handled this by the time you find yourself here, and in a sense you would be right, because Parliament had in fact passed Chimney Sweepers Acts as far back as 1788, then again in 1834 and 1840. What those laws mostly demonstrate, though, is the enormous gap between passing a law and actually enforcing one since the practice persisted well into the Victorian era regardless, propped up by economic necessity and a general reluctance to inspect what happened up inside someone else's chimney. It took a further act in 1875, following the tireless campaigning of the reformer George Smith, before enforcement finally caught up with the legislation and climbing boys genuinely began to disappear from London's rooftops. Move underground and the logic repeats itself with different scenery. In the coal mines, children called trappers are stationed alone in near total darkness for shifts stretching up to 12 hours, their entire job consisting of opening and closing small ventilation doors each time a coal wagon needs to pass through. Imagine being paid to sit by yourself in the dark for half a day, responsible for a single hinge, with nothing to do in between but wait and listen for wheels in the blackness. It is less a job than a sensory deprivation experiment with a wage attached. Slightly older children fare no better. Known as hurriers or putters, they crawl through tunnels too low for an adult to stand upright in, pulling or pushing loaded coal tubs behind them. Sometimes fitted with a harness and chain around the waist so they can drag the load more efficiently, which is to say they were, quite literally, rigged up like draft animals and sent to pull cargo through the dark on their hands and knees. Public reaction to this only really arrived once people were forced to actually look at it, which happened through the Ashley Mines Commission report, whose findings and illustrations shocked a reading public that had apparently found it much easier to tolerate child labour underground when it stayed comfortably out of sight. The resulting Mines Act of 1842 banned women and children under 10 from working below ground at all, a genuinely significant reform, though it is worth noting that 10 years old remained, for some time afterward, considered perfectly acceptable. The textile mills present their own version of the same economic logic. Small children work as piecers, dashing in to rejoin threads that snap on machinery that never stops moving for their convenience, and as scavengers, whose job is to crawl underneath the machines while they are still running to clear away debris and loose cotton. A task that placed a child's limbs directly beneath moving parts, with a regularity that produced exactly the injuries you would expect. Reformers eventually introduced the half-timer system, which allowed children to split their day between mill labour and a few hours of schooling, a compromise that reads today as both progress and a fairly grim admission of how little was actually being offered. Across the century, a steady drip of factory acts gradually raised minimum working ages and trimmed maximum hours inch by inch, but enforcement lagged so far behind the paperwork that meaningful change arrived more as a slow tide than a single turning point. Away from the chimneys and coal seams, another industry built its entire cheap labour model around exposing young bodies to poison. This time inside the match factories, most infamously the Bryant and May works. There young women and girls dipped matches in white phosphorus for hours a day, breathing fumes that could trigger a condition known as phossy jaw, a slow and disfiguring necrosis of the jawbone capable, in its worst cases, of killing the person it had already disfigured. All of this existed to manufacture an object that sold for a fraction of a penny. Conditions eventually grew intolerable enough that in 1888 the match factory women organised and walked out in what became known as the Match Girls' Strike, a genuine turning point in British labour history. Part of what made it land with the public was precisely who was striking. Not small children, easy to pity and easier to dismiss, but grown women. Demonstrating in plain view that the same industrial logic used to justify child labour, that a worker's body was simply a disposable input, applied just as coldly to adults. Even children too small or too unskilled for factory work found their own precarious corner of the economy, sweeping street crossings for a living. Armed with nothing but a broom, a crossing sweeper would dash into the middle of a busy, manure-choked London street and clear a path through the muck for well-dressed pedestrians crossing to the other side, hoping for a coin in exchange for keeping someone's boots clean. What ties all three settings together, chimney, coal seam, and cotton mill is a piece of economic reasoning so cold it barely qualifies as reasoning at all. A child's small size, low wages and general disposability made them, from a purely commercial standpoint, ideally suited to precisely the tasks a grown adult's body was least equipped to survive. It was never a design flaw in the system. It was the business plan. Watch a fashionable Victorian woman get dressed for the day. Because the process involves more structural engineering, more assistance, and more genuine physical risk than most modern people apply to assembling flat-pack furniture. The corset itself is not the flimsy lace confection you might picture. It is stiffened with strips of whalebone, or baleen, or increasingly by the 1870s with steel busks down the front, and it is laced up the back with a cord that someone else has to pull, because you cannot generate that kind of leverage on your own body. This is why a lady's maid exists, at least for anyone with the means to employ one, and why the morning routine of a fashionable woman resembles less a private ritual and more a two-person job. Not unlike being fitted for a suit of armour by someone who also has opinions about how tightly the straps should go. You have probably heard the 16-inch waist stories, the ones where corsets are described as instruments of near-medieval torture capable of squeezing a grown woman down to the circumference of a dinner plate. Mostly, this is exaggeration. Most Victorian women who wore corsets, which was most Victorian women, reduced their natural waist by a modest few inches, not by removing several inches of actual rib cage that was never there to begin with. A fashionable minority did lace considerably tighter, sometimes dramatically so, and it is their extreme silhouettes that survive in photographs and fuel the myth. In the same way a handful of extreme diet influencers today would give future historians a wildly skewed impression of how everyone eats breakfast. Even the modest version raised real medical questions at the time, and doctors argued about it with the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty modern doctors bring to any wellness trend involving compression garments or extreme dieting. Some physicians insisted corsets restricted breathing by limiting how far the lower ribs and diaphragm could expand, which, mechanically speaking, was simply true. Others worried about displaced internal organs, weakened back muscles from a lifetime of external support doing a muscle's job, and general long-term wear on the body. Nobody had a randomised controlled trial to settle it, so the debate ran for decades, largely unresolved, while women continued lacing up every morning regardless of which doctor happened to be right. Then there is the crinoline, which arrived around 1856 as genuinely an improvement. Before it, achieving the fashionable bell-shaped skirt meant piling on layer after layer of heavy petticoats, which were hot, cumbersome, and exhausting to walk in. The crinoline replaced all of that with a lightweight cage of steel hoops, considerably cooler and lighter than the petticoats it replaced, and considerably, spectacularly wider. Skirts ballooned outward to diameters that made a woman, in effect, the widest object in any room she entered. This created problems that no one had fully anticipated, chief among them the simple architectural fact that most doorways were not built to accommodate a structure the width of a small dining table. Getting through one required a practiced sideways shuffle, a manoeuvre every fashionable woman had to master the way you might master parallel parking, except the stakes were social embarrassment rather than a scraped bumper. Sitting down required its own technique entirely, a controlled collapse that compressed the hoops just enough without launching the front of the skirt up into your own face or, worse, into someone else's. Then there were the hazards nobody could fully engineer around. The crinoline could catch on furniture, snag on a carriage wheel, or get pulled into passing machinery. All of which happened often enough to be a recognised reported danger rather than a rare freak occurrence. Worse still, the fabric was light and voluminous, which made it wonderful for silhouette and absolutely terrible near an open flame. Crinoline fires were a real and documented hazard of Victorian daily life, because a hem drifting too close to a hearth or a candle could go up astonishingly fast, faster than anyone standing nearby had time to react to. Women died this way, including, notably, two half-sisters of Oscar Wilde, who lost their lives to a dress fire in 1871. It is a strange thing to sit with, that getting dressed for an ordinary evening carried a real risk of catastrophic fire, in a way that a beeping smoke alarm and a fire-retardant sofa have made almost impossible to imagine today. By the 1870s and 1880s, fashion had begun moving away from the crinolines all around bell shape toward the bustle, which took a more targeted approach, projecting fullness out behind the wearer instead of in every direction at once. It was in its way an admission that the crinoline had simply gotten out of hand, a slow retreat from peak structural ambition towards something marginally more containable, though still requiring its own padding, its own frame, and its own careful arrangement. None of this at any point was something a woman could do alone. Lacing a corset to the correct tension, hooking a bodice up the back, pinning a bustle into place, arranging the many layers of underskirts so that nothing bunched or gapped. All of it demanded a second pair of hands, patience, and usually a lady's maid who had done this exact routine every single morning for years, and could probably do it half asleep. For anyone without a maid, it meant recruiting a sister, a mother, or a friend, turning the simple act of getting dressed into a small domestic collaboration. Stand still while all of this happens to you, and notice the sounds as much as anything, the creak of busk against fabric, the soft thud of hooks finding their eyes, the rustle of steel hoops settling into place, and underneath it all the faint chemical tang of the starch used to stiffen collars and cuffs. It is not a quiet process, and it is not a fast one. A full ensemble, properly assembled, could easily eat up the better part of an hour before you had so much as left the bedroom. Not everyone accepted this arrangement without a fight. Through the mid to late Victorian period, a genuine dress reform movement took shape, culminating in the founding of the Rational Dress Society in 1881, whose members argued at some volume that lacing your ribcage into the shape of an hourglass was doing considerable damage to your health, and campaigned for looser, more practical clothing, including early trouser-like garments a woman could actually walk a normal stride in. Fashionable society responded to this proposal about the way you would expect fashionable society to respond to comfort, which is to say with cartoons. The reformers were mocked in the press, treated as eccentrics, and largely ignored by the very women whose spines they were trying to save. Nor was corsetry something you eased into as an adult, the way one might ease into a mortgage. Young girls were often put into lighter training corsets from a fairly early age, on the theory that a properly disciplined figure needed years of quiet cultivation rather than a single evening of squeezing before a dance. A girl might therefore spend her entire adolescence growing up inside progressively firmer versions of the same garment, her body shaped, quite literally, around the expectation of what it was eventually meant to become. Reform-minded doctors tried a different tactic entirely, bypassing argument altogether in favour of pictures. They published illustrated pamphlets containing stark anatomical diagrams showing, in unflinching cross-section, exactly how a tightly laced corset displaced and compressed the ribs and the organs crowded beneath them, evidently hoping that seeing a squeezed liver rendered in ink might succeed, where decades of complaining had failed. It did not, particularly. Fashion, as it turns out, has never much cared what a diagram thinks. Consider then that all of this effort was expended not for a special occasion, not for a ball or a wedding, but simply to be considered decently dressed for an unremarkable Tuesday, which puts a fairly ordinary flat-pack bookshelf into humbling perspective. Step into a household that has just lost someone, because grief here is not merely a feeling, it is an entire uniform, a wardrobe schedule, and in some cases jewellery made from the deceased's actual hair. The tone for all of this was set, quite literally, from the top. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria did not simply mourn him for a respectable interval and then move along, as convention of the time might have suggested. She wore black for the rest of her life, roughly 40 more years of it, retreating from public life so completely that it became something of a national talking point. Her example did not create Victorian mourning culture from nothing, but it certainly amplified it, turning what had been a serious but manageable set of customs into something approaching a national institution, with the monarch herself as its most visible and most permanent practitioner. For an ordinary widow, the rules were spelled out with the precision of a legal document. There was a period known as deep mourning, commonly cited as lasting a year and a day, during which she was expected to wear black crepe, a dull, deliberately non-reflective silk chosen specifically because it did not shine or draw attention the way ordinary silk did. Only after this period ended could she move into half mourning, gradually reintroducing colour, though not just any colour, only the approved muted palette of grey, mauve and lavender, easing back into normal life one subdued shade at a time, like a dimmer switch being turned up by careful degrees. And it did not stop with widows. Etiquette manuals and household guides of the period laid out entire tables of mourning obligations, depending on exactly how the deceased related to you: spouse, parent, sibling, child, even a fairly distant cousin, each with its own prescribed duration and depth of black. Getting it wrong, wearing the wrong shade too early, or abandoning full mourning a few weeks ahead of schedule was not a private matter. It was the kind of thing that got noticed, discussed and judged by everyone from your neighbours to your own extended family, functioning as a strict, unspoken social algorithm that everyone around you was quietly running in the background. None of this restraint applied to accessories, oddly enough. Jewellery still had a place in mourning, provided it was the right kind, and the right kind, overwhelmingly, was Whitley jet, a black gemstone-like material mined along the Yorkshire coast. Its appeal was almost embarrassingly practical. It was black, it did not reflect light in an attention-seeking way, and it therefore slotted neatly into an outfit that was otherwise designed to project restrained. Respectable sorrow. Brooches, necklaces and bracelets carved from jet became a thriving cottage industry in their own right. Essentially the approved gemstone of grief. Then there is the custom that tends to make modern audiences sit up a little straighter, which is mourning hair work. Families would take locks of hair from the person who had died and have them woven, plaited, or otherwise worked into jewellery, watch chains, or even small wreaths, kept as an intimate physical memorial of someone who was actually, literally, still a part of the object being worn. It reads today as macabre, mostly because contemporary mourning tends to be abstract, a photograph, a memory, a story retold. Victorian mourning, by contrast, wanted something you could hold, and hair, unlike almost everything else about a person, does not decay. All of this required outfitting, and outfitting required shopping, which is where the more commercial side of Victorian death comes into focus. Specialist mourning warehouses, of which Jay's General Mourning Warehouse in London is a well-documented real example, operated essentially like a department store built entirely around bereavement. A grieving family, often reeling and with very little bandwidth for decision-making, could walk in and walk out having outfitted an entire household in correct mourning attire, purchased black-bordered stationery for the inevitable correspondence, and picked up whatever else etiquette demanded, all in a single efficient transaction. For families without the money for elaborate dress or jet jewellery, there was still a way to signal appropriate solemnity, and that was to hire mutes, men dressed head to toe in sombre black, who stood silently at the door of the house of mourning or walked ahead of the funeral procession. They did not know the deceased. They were not family. They were, in effect, rented atmosphere, professional gravity purchased by the hour to make sure a funeral looked as serious as it felt, in much the same spirit as hiring extra staff to make an event look better attended than it actually is. Layer all of this together, the mandated fabrics, the colour-coded timelines, the jet, the hair work, the stationary, the hired mourners. And what emerges is not simply a culture that took grief seriously, though it certainly did, but a culture that had also, quite efficiently, built an entire retail sector on top of that grief, complete with its own dress code, its own supply chain, and its own etiquette enforcement. Grief even had its own postal code of a sort. Households in mourning wrote their correspondence on stationery and envelopes edged in a thick black border. And the width of that border was not arbitrary but conventional, shrinking by careful degrees as the deepest phase of mourning gradually eased into something more manageable. A friend receiving a letter could therefore glance at the envelope before even opening it, and know, more or less exactly, how recently the sender had been bereaved, and how severe the loss was considered to be, all without a single word of explanation. Families also commissioned printed in memoriam cards, modest keepsakes bearing the name of the deceased, their dates, and often a verse or a passage of scripture chosen to suit the occasion. These were distributed to friends and relatives as something between a formal announcement and a memento, not unlike a wedding invitation that had wandered into entirely the wrong sort of stationery shop. When mourning reached beyond a single household, up to the level of the royal family or a recognised state occasion, its reach extended further still, out into the ordinary evening plans of people who had never met the deceased at all. Theatres and opera houses sometimes curtailed their performances or postponed openings out of respect, and the fashionable social season could quietly rearrange itself around a death announced in the newspaper only that morning. It is, in the end, hard to know whether to be moved or slightly alarmed that Victorian London had in effect invented the concept of grief merchandising, and made sure you could not leave the house without wearing proof of purchase. Sit still for the family portrait, because the deceased relative propped carefully in the armchair beside you is not a prop, they are, quite genuinely. The subject of today's sitting. This was not some fringe practice conducted by a handful of eccentrics. Post-mortem photography, sometimes called memento mori photography, was a widespread and broadly accepted part of Victorian life from the 1840s all the way through the turn of the century, using whatever process happened to be current at the time, the early daguerreotype, later the ambrotype, and eventually the albumen print. It touched nearly every social class in one form or another, because death itself touched nearly every family, repeatedly and often without warning. It was especially common for infants and children, for reasons that make grim sense once you consider the child mortality rates of the period. A photograph was expensive, a genuine luxury purchase requiring a trip to a professional studio, and many families simply never got around to it, or could never afford it, while a child was alive and healthy. If that child then died, which happened with heartbreaking frequency, the family might commission a photograph for the first and only time, meaning the sole surviving image of that child. The only visual record that they had existed at all was taken after death. Seen that way, the practice starts to look less like a morbid curiosity and more like a desperate, tender act of preservation. The photographers and families involved generally went to considerable lengths to make the image look peaceful rather than clinical. Bodies were carefully arranged to suggest gentle sleep, eyes closed, expression soft, sometimes seated upright in what had been the person's favourite chair, positioned as if merely resting between one moment and the next. Popular history loves to claim that elaborate metal posing stands were routinely used to prop bodies upright, for the long exposure times early photography demanded. The same kind of stands genuinely used to keep living sitters still during those exposures. The truth is more modest. Such supports for the deceased existed and were used on occasion, but they were considerably rarer than the internet would have you believe, and most post-mortem portraits relied on simpler methods: a supportive chair, careful family hands just out of frame. A body naturally still, because it no longer needed to hold itself up. Often the rest of the family joined in the frame, gathered around the deceased the way they might gather for any ordinary family portrait, parents flanking a child, siblings arranged nearby, everyone dressed in their best. Looking at the results now produces an odd double vision, because the composition itself is completely unremarkable, a standard studio family grouping, and yet one member of that group is not breathing, and every single person in the photograph knew it while it was being taken. To understand why this did not strike contemporaries as ghoulish, it helps to remember just how saturated Victorian daily life was with death in the first place. Disease swept through cities with a regularity that modern audiences, accustomed to antibiotics and vaccines, find hard to fully absorb. Childbirth carried real and substantial risk to both mother and infant. Industrial accidents killed workers routinely enough to barely make the local papers. Death was not sequestered away in hospitals and hospices the way it largely is now, encountered mainly through screens or euphemism. It happened at home, in the front bedroom, surrounded by family. And everyone present had likely already sat through several funerals of their own by the time they reached adulthood. Set against that backdrop, and against the elaborate mourning culture already covered by the black crepe, the jet jewellery, and the hairwork kept as a physical keepsake, a photograph of the departed fits in, rather than stands out. It is simply another object in the same category, another way of holding on to something tangible when the person themselves is gone. A modern viewer's first instinct, faced with one of these images, tends to be a small recoil, a sense that something has crossed a line that should not be crossed. A Victorian family looking at the same photograph mostly just saw their child, or their mother, or their husband, looking, for the last time, at peace. None of this required a particularly modern sensibility to appreciate, just a very different relationship with how visible death was allowed to be. We now keep thousands of photographs of the people we love stored on a phone we barely think about, taken casually, constantly, without ceremony. And it rarely occurs to us how strange that would have seemed to someone for whom a single photograph was a rare and precious event, worth commissioning even, and perhaps especially, after it was already too late. By the later decades of the century, technology did to post-mortem photography what it eventually does to everything, which is to say it made it cheaper and more common. The small, mass-producible photograph known as the carte de visite brought portraiture within reach of families who could never have afforded the earlier daguerreotype process, and post-mortem images travelled the same route into ordinary homes. These photographs were not kept apart in some separate, solemn folder either. Families slotted them into the same dedicated photograph album used for portraits of living relatives, so that a page might hold a christening, a wedding, and a deceased infant in its best clothes, one after another, with no sense that anything about the arrangement was unusual. Travelling photographers understood the particular urgency of this branch of their trade, and advertised accordingly in the local newspapers, offering explicitly to visit a grieving household at short notice, day or night. A death, after all, did not wait for business hours, and a family hoping for one final photographic likeness needed someone who could arrive quickly, before the carefully arranged expression of peaceful rest gave way to something photography could no longer soften. Some studios went further still and built a genuine specialty out of the work, becoming known, quietly but reliably, as the photographer a family called first in the worst hour of their lives. It is difficult to imagine how such a business would advertise itself cheerfully in any era, and yet the demand for it was constant enough to sustain a livelihood. Perhaps the real difference is not that Victorians found comfort in a still, silent photograph of someone they loved, but that we now have so many photographs we no longer notice how strange it is that stillness was ever the whole point. Pack a lunch and bring the children, because a hanging outside Newgate prison is, for a very large slice of London, a perfectly wholesome and enormously popular day out. Do not picture a small, solemn crowd gathered in respectful silence. Picture instead tens of thousands of people packed shoulder to shoulder in the streets around the prison, because that is what contemporary accounts describe for the more high-profile hangings of the era. This was not a niche event for the morbidly curious. It was mainstream entertainment, drawing a cross-section of London society roughly comparable, in modern terms, to a major outdoor concert, if the headline act were a man about to be dropped through a trapdoor. The atmosphere matched the crowd size. Street vendors moved through the throng selling food and drink, because a crowd that size gets hungry regardless of what it came to watch. And Victorian entrepreneurs were not about to let a captive audience go unfed. Printers did brisk business too, hawking cheap souvenir broadsheets that claimed to contain the condemned person's last dying speech and confession, complete with dramatic detail and moral commentary. The delightfully absurd part is that these broadsheets were very often printed and sold before the execution had actually taken place, meaning crowds were buying a dead man's confession while he was technically still alive and presumably unaware that his final words had already gone to press. Wherever large crowds gather with their attention fixed on a spectacle rather than their pockets, pickpockets thrive, and Newgate hangings were no exception, functioning as something close to a trade convention for London's light-fingered community. Meanwhile, those with money to spend could rent a window or a rooftop spot overlooking the gallows, paying a premium for a clearer sightline in a system that, if you squint, resembles a very early and very macabre version of scalped concert tickets, premium seating included, view of the trapdoor guaranteed. It was not universally beloved, even at the time. The 1840 execution of Francois Benjamin Courvoisier drew two of the era's most famous writers, Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray, both of whom attended, evidently out of curiosity as much as anything, and both of whom came away disturbed, not by the execution itself so much as by the crowd surrounding it, rowdy, jeering, treating the whole affair as festival rather than solemn occasion. Both writers later wrote against the practice of public execution, arguing that whatever deterrent value it was supposed to have was thoroughly drowned out by a crowd that seemed to be having, by any reasonable measure, a wonderful time. Their objections were part of a broader shift in sentiment that eventually produced actual legislative change. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868 moved executions behind prison walls out of public view entirely, ending the practice of hanging as spectator sport. Michael Barrett has the peculiar historical distinction of being the last person publicly hanged in England that same year, meaning an entire era of gallows as entertainment came to a close within his lifetime, or rather at the exact moment his did. It is worth sitting with just how thoroughly normalised all of this had become before that law arrived. Nobody organising a family outing to Newgate thought of themselves as doing anything unusual, any more than a modern family thinks twice about a trip to a theme park. The vendors selling food were not treated as tasteless opportunists, but simply as part of the expected infrastructure of a big public event, the same way you would expect a hot dog stand outside a stadium. The broadsheet sellers hawking pre-written confessions were not seen as ghoulish either, just enterprising, giving the crowd a souvenir to take home and reread later, the 19th century equivalent of a programme booklet. What makes the pre-printed confessions especially strange, the more you think about them, is the sheer logistical confidence involved. Someone had to sit down, compose a plausible final statement, set the type, and run the presses, all on the assumption that the execution would proceed exactly as scheduled and produce exactly the sort of remorseful last words the public wanted to read. It treated a human being's death as a publishing deadline, one that grimly was rarely missed. Step back far enough and the whole scene resolves into a strange kind of civic theatre. A punishment designed partly to deter crime, and partly, whether anyone admitted it or not, to give a very large number of Londoners something to do on a weekday morning, snacks included, souvenirs optional, premium seating available for the right price. The hangman himself, oddly enough, could become something of a public figure in all this, and William Calcraft, who served as the principal executioner in London for decades through the middle of the century, was known to ordinary Londoners by name and by reputation. His particular reputation, unfortunately, rested on his habit of using a shorter drop than was strictly advisable, which meant a good number of his hangings did not go quickly or cleanly, leaving the condemned struggling for a considerably longer time than the crowd found acceptable. And the crowd did find it unacceptable, discussing the technique afterward with the same critical disappointment you might apply to a poorly executed magic trick. Once the spectacle concluded, the merchandising of the day was not quite finished either. Small pieces of the actual execution rope were sometimes cut up and sold afterward as souvenirs, prized by certain buyers as good luck charms, since owning a fragment of the rope that had just been used to end a life was thought, by some, to transfer a little luck to the person carrying it. Enterprising showmen, never ones to leave money on the table, set up stalls near the gallows offering waxwork recreations or peep show style viewings of famous executions from years past, aimed squarely at anyone who had missed the original event or simply wanted a repeat performance. In this way, a single hanging could go on generating income long after the rope itself had been cut into souvenirs. Madame Tussauds took this afterlife of crime a step further with its Chamber of Horrors, an entire dedicated gallery of wax figures depicting notorious murderers and their victims, often modelled directly from death masks taken from the actual executed criminal, sometimes within hours of the hanging itself. Families paid an extra admission fee beyond the regular waxworks to file past these grim tableaux, turning the public appetite for a good execution into a permanent, standing exhibition that required no gallows, no crowd, and no particular occasion at all, just a spare afternoon and a taste for the macabre. The next time you complain about the queue at a theme park, remember that Victorian London once queued overnight for a considerably grimmer main event and called it a lovely outing. Follow the crowd into a smoky back room behind the pub, because the evening's entertainment involves a pit, a terrier, and a truly astonishing number of rats. Nobody present considers this remotely unusual. By the time you have arrived in Victorian London, some blood sports have already been swept off the official books. The Cruelty to Animals Act of 1835 formally banned bear baiting, bull baiting and cockfighting, part of a broader and genuinely sincere shift in middle-class sensibility about animal cruelty. The same sentiment that had led to the founding of the RSPCA back in 1824. On paper, this looks like real moral progress, a society waking up to the suffering it had been treating as sport for centuries. In practice, the law had a rather significant blind spot, and that blind spot was rats. Rat baiting, or ratting as it was commonly known, was not covered by the same protections extended to farm animals and game animals under the cruelty legislation of the day, apparently on the reasoning that rats were vermin rather than animals deserving of consideration. This left ratting entirely legal, and it remained hugely popular in pubs and dedicated venues throughout much of the Victorian era, thriving in exactly the kind of smoky backroom you have just walked into. The format was simple enough to explain in a single breath. A terrier was placed into a pit, along with a large number of live rats, sometimes dozens at once, and the dog was timed as it killed them, while the crowd around the pit placed bets on exactly how fast the job would get done. It was, in other words, blood sport reduced to a stopwatch and a leaderboard, with wagering woven through every part of the evening, on the total time, on the body count, on which dog would outperform which. Some ratting dogs became genuinely famous within this subculture, treated with the sort of reverence modern sports fans reserve for a record-breaking athlete. London had well-known venues built specifically around the sport, Jemmy Shaw's establishment among the most celebrated, and it was there that a dog named Billy reportedly killed around 100 rats in under 6 minutes back in the 1820s. A performance so remarkable that enthusiasts kept discussing it admiringly for years, even decades, afterward, the way old-timers at a pub might still argue about a legendary sports record from their childhood. Cockfighting and dogfighting, meanwhile, did not simply vanish because a law said they should. Both persisted covertly, tucked into secret venues protected by informal networks of organisers and spectators, who had every financial incentive, given the scale of betting involved, to keep the whole enterprise running quietly rather than let it die out because of an inconvenient act of Parliament. Gambling, in fact, sits at the centre of every single one of these activities, legal or not. The actual engine driving attendance far more than any love of dogs or roosters for their own sake. What makes all of this genuinely strange, rather than merely unpleasant, is the contradiction sitting right in the middle of it. This is the same society developing an increasingly sentimental, almost modern attachment to pets. The same decades that saw growing public concern for animal welfare organised enough to found a formal society dedicated to preventing cruelty. And yet a very large number of those same Londoners, quite possibly some of the very people donating to animal welfare causes, spent their evenings in a back room cheering as a dog tour through a pit full of rats for sport and profit. Nobody involved seemed to experience this as hypocrisy, which is perhaps the most telling detail of all. Bear baiting had been banned because bears, it seems, had crossed some threshold into animals worth protecting. Rats had not crossed that threshold, not even close, and so an entire evening's entertainment could be built around their deaths without triggering the same moral unease that a bear or a bull would have provoked. The line between barbaric and merely a fun night out was drawn, apparently, somewhere in the middle of the rodent kingdom, and nobody at the time seemed inclined to ask exactly why. It is worth noticing how familiar this kind of selective compassion still feels, even now, applied to entirely different animals for entirely different reasons, which suggests Victorian Londoners were not uniquely inconsistent so much as simply an early, particularly vivid example of a habit most societies never fully shake. The aristocracy, for their part, had developed their own perfectly respectable version of the same basic urge, dressed in considerably finer tailoring. Live pigeon shooting became a fashionable pastime among the wealthy, with dedicated clubs such as the Hurlingham Club hosting competitions in which birds were released from mechanical traps for the specific purpose of being shot out of the air. Prize money and social standing awarded to whoever proved most efficient at it. Nobody organised a raid on Hurlingham, because the whole affair carried none of the disreputable stink of the rat pit, despite being, in every practical sense, the deliberate killing of animals purely for entertainment. Fox hunting occupied a similarly protected position in the social order, romanticised endlessly in paintings and literature as a noble, time-honoured pursuit of the countryside gentry, complete with its own elaborate customs, dress and vocabulary. Strip away the scarlet coats and the ceremonial horn, however, and what remained was a pack of hounds chasing a single frightened animal across open country until it was run to exhaustion and killed. An outcome no less final than anything happening in a rat pit, just achieved at a considerably more leisurely pace and with considerably better boots. What separated a barbaric blood sport from a respectable one then had remarkably little to do with how much the animal in question actually suffered. It had rather more to do with the size of the entry fee, the cut of the coat, and the social class of the person doing the killing. Somewhere between the Asps a pamphlet in one pocket and the betting slip in the other, Victorian London managed to hold two completely contradictory opinions about animal welfare at once, and slept just fine. Pay your penny at the door and step inside, because the Victorian public's appetite for looking at extraordinary human bodies has built an entire, thriving, and deeply uncomfortable industry. Up on Piccadilly, the Egyptian Hall stands with its improbable columns and pseudo-Egyptian carvings, looking like a museum that got lost on its way to the British Museum and decided to open a sideshow instead. This is the respectable end of the business, the one that lets a well-dressed gentleman bring his wife and still feel he has spent an improving afternoon rather than gawked at a stranger for sport. Down the social ladder, in penny gaffs and canvas tents that follow the fairs from town to town, the same basic transaction happens for a fraction of the price and none of the polish, with barkers shouting into the street instead of printed handbills doing the inviting. Before you ever see the attraction, you will hear the pitch, and it is worth pausing to admire the pitch as a genuine performing art. A showman stationed outside the curtain or the shopfront window has rehearsed his patter until it runs like a machine, building you up with hints of the astonishing, the terrible, the never before witnessed, all before you have handed over a single coin. It is, in essence, a movie trailer performed live by a man in a loud waistcoat, and it works for exactly the same reason movie trailers work. The anticipation is often the best part. Inside, the hall itself does its best to seem worthy of the price of admission. Gaslight flickers along velvet ropes strung between polished pillars, and a printed programme, sold separately of course, lists the order of attractions with the gravity of an opera bill. Conversation stays hushed, almost reverent, punctuated by the occasional creak of floorboards as the crowd shuffles from one platform to the next. Even the silence has been staged, calibrated to feel like the quiet of a lecture hall rather than the quiet of people trying not to be caught staring. In a shopfront in Whitechapel, behind a painted banner promising something monstrous, a young man named Joseph Merrick sits on display for anyone willing to pay to look at him, his body altered by a condition no one in the room can name or explain. The room smells of damp plaster and cheap tallow candles, and the particular staleness of a space where people stand and stare rather than move. It will not be until 1884 that a surgeon named Frederick Treves takes a professional interest in him, and in the meantime, Merrick's entire livelihood depends on being looked at by strangers who have paid specifically for the privilege of that discomfort. Contrast that shopfront with a reception given to Charles Stratton, a touring performer with dwarfism billed to the public as General Tom Thumb, managed with tremendous showmanship by the American impresario P.T. Barnum. Stratton's tour of London is nothing short of a sensation, drawing enormous crowds and, in a detail that tells you everything about how thoroughly this business had been laundered into acceptability, an actual audience with Queen Victoria herself. Somewhere in London tonight, a man is being exhibited in a shop window for pennies, while another man of similarly small stature is shaking hands with the monarch, and nobody involved seems to find the contrast strange. Move along the row of exhibits, and you will find bearded ladies, conjoined twins, people with dwarfism or gigantism, and performers marketed as missing links or wild men captured in some suitably distant corner of the earth. Almost none of these backstories survive contact with scrutiny. The wild man was very likely born a few counties away, the exotic name was invented for the poster, and the tale of capture in a remote jungle was written by the same person who wrote the ticket prices. It is essentially the Victorian precursor to an engagement-optimised headline, engineered purely to make you stop scrolling, or in this case, stop walking. Newspapers do their part too, running advertisements and glowing notices for the latest attraction with a breathless enthusiasm that would not look out of place on a modern review site, 5 stars, must see, unlike anything London has witnessed. A favourable mention in the right paper can turn a modest exhibit into the talk of the season, and showmen court these notices as carefully as any producer courts a review today, because a single well-placed paragraph can fill the hall for a week. What keeps the whole enterprise polite is the framing. Slap the word lecture onto a programme, promise instruction in anatomy, ethnology or natural history, and suddenly a middle-class family can attend without feeling they have done anything untoward. A pamphlet full of measurements and Latin terms sits beside the ticket booth like a diploma, reassuring you that your penny has purchased education rather than mere curiosity. Strip away the pamphlet, though, and the appeal underneath is identical to the one drawing crowds to the Twopenny tent 3 streets over, the simple, ancient human urge to look at a body that is not like your own. This is the uncomfortable part you are meant to sit with as you walk the length of the hall. Every person on display here is, in some sense, doing exactly what a great many other Victorians are doing to survive, selling their labour. It happens that the labour being sold is the fact of their own body, presented for inspection, priced for viewing, and narrated by someone else's invented story. Some performers, it should be said, found genuine financial independence and even fame through these shows. In an era with vanishingly few other options for people whose bodies did not fit the mould demanded by factories, domestic service, or polite society. That does not make the transaction comfortable. It only makes it complicated. Adding to the illusion of legitimacy, members of genuine scientific and ethnological societies sometimes attend these exhibitions in a professional capacity, taking notes, offering commentary, occasionally publishing their observations in respectable journals. Their presence lends the whole affair a thin veneer of scholarship, as though a paying audience gawking through an afternoon were meaningfully different work from a paying audience gawking through an afternoon with a notebook in hand. It rarely is. Notice, too, how completely ordinary this feels to everyone around you. Nobody in this hall is behaving as though anything unusual is occurring. Children point without being shushed. Gentlemen consult their pocket watches to check they still have time to catch the next attraction before dinner. The whole event has the atmosphere of a matinee, not a moral crisis, because as far as Victorian London is concerned, this is simply an afternoon's entertainment, filed somewhere between the waxworks and the menagerie. By the time you step back out onto Piccadilly, blinking in the daylight, you will have paid your penny, received your pamphlet, and witnessed several human beings reduced to line items on a programme. Somewhere in this same circuit of tents and lecture halls, you might find a performer billed to the public as Crowforini, a young girl exhibited in London during the 1880s who lived with a rare genetic condition that covered her entire body in fine hair. The showman did not simply present the condition and let it speak for itself. Instead, they built her an entire fabricated backstory, presenting her to paying crowds as a genuine missing link between humans and apes, a living specimen plucked from some remote jungle rather than a child born with a hair growth disorder. Not every Victorian was comfortable watching this industry operate in plain sight. A small but genuine current of criticism ran through certain doctors, journalists, and social reformers of the period, who argued in print and in public lectures of their own that putting people with visible physical differences on a stage for profit was exploitation, no matter how much anatomical terminology got layered on top of the spectacle to make it sound scientific. And yet none of this hand-wringing amounted to much in practical terms, since it rarely translated into any actual legal restriction on the trade. Strange as it may sound, given everything you have just read, performers themselves occupied a position of real, if limited, power within this exploitative arrangement. A genuinely popular attraction was valuable, and value in Victorian show business could be negotiated. Successful performers secured real wages, arranged international tours across Europe and America, and in a fortunate handful of cases retired with genuine financial comfort, an outcome almost nobody else born into their circumstances could have expected. The lecture on ethnology, you will notice, has told you a great deal about Victorian curiosity, and almost nothing true about the people you paid to see. Hold still while a stranger runs his fingers over the bumps on your skull, because he is about to tell you, with complete scientific confidence, exactly what kind of person you are. The practice tracing back to this moment on your scalp was founded by the German physician Franz Joseph Gall late in the previous century, but it is a Scottish lawyer, George Combe, who has turned it into a national obsession. His book, published in 1828 and titled The Constitution of Man, becomes one of the best-selling books of the entire era, outselling works of far greater scientific accuracy on the strength of a single, wildly appealing premise: that your character is not a mystery, but a map, and that map can be read with two hands and a bit of confidence. According to this map, the brain is not one organ, but a committee of dozens, each responsible for its own slice of your personality, and each one, conveniently, corresponding to a specific patch of your skull. There is a region for amativeness, governing your romantic and physical affections. There is combativeness, for your taste in a fight. There is veneration, for how devoutly you kneel in church. The practitioner does not need to see inside your head to assess any of this. He only needs to press his fingertips along your scalp, feel for the swells and hollows, and read the result the way a jeweller reads a stone. The appointment itself has a ritual quality. You take a seat, remove your hat, perhaps unpin your hair if you are a woman, and the practitioner opens a ledger in which he will record his findings in careful columns, one for each faculty, exactly as a doctor might record measurements today. His hands move over your scalp with a clinical detachment that somehow makes the whole procedure feel more credible rather than less, the way a firm handshake makes a stranger's claims sound truer than they probably are. Beyond amativeness, combativeness and veneration, the full phrenological map runs to dozens of named faculties, secretiveness, for your capacity to keep a confidence, acquisitiveness, for your appetite for accumulating possessions, and benevolence for simple kindness, each occupying its own patch of territory on the skull like countries on a very small, very personal atlas. It is, in structure if not in accuracy, remarkably similar to a modern personality quiz or horoscope, promising to sort the entire chaotic mess of human character into a tidy, memorizable list of categories. To help him along, most parlours keep a ceramic bust on the counter, a white head divided into numbered zones like a butcher's chart for the brain, sold as a teaching aid so that both practitioner and customer can follow along and agree on which bump means what. It sits there with the calm authority of a chart in a doctor's office, lending the whole enterprise a clinical gloss it has not remotely earned. None of this is treated as parlour amusement, though it would make more sense if it were. Travelling phrenologists set up shop in market towns for a few days at a time, and dedicated phrenological societies and parlours operate as fixtures of city life, charging a fee for a full reading much the way you might pay for a photograph or a portrait. People walk in for entertainment and walk out with what they consider a diagnosis. Storefronts advertising phrenological readings often display a painted wooden head out front, sectioned and labelled in the same manner as the ceramic bust indoors, functioning essentially as an oversized shingle no passerby could possibly misread. Dedicated societies hold public lectures on the subject as well, drawing audiences eager to learn the system for themselves, so that reading heads becomes, for a while, something of a fashionable party trick, a way to impress guests at dinner, without needing to actually know very much about the people whose skulls you are assessing. Consider what this diagnosis is then used for. A young couple weighing marriage might consult a phrenologist to check their compatibility, submitting their skulls for inspection the way a modern couple might compare star signs, except with rather more finger pressure involved and rather more confidence placed in the result. A young man uncertain of his path in life might be told, on the evidence of a bump above his ear, that he is suited to the clergy rather than to trade, and he may genuinely reorganise his future around that verdict. The results do not stay confined to the parlour. Phrenological journals circulate the latest theories to a genuinely wide readership, and advice columns of the day occasionally lean on phrenological language to explain why a marriage failed or a business partnership soured, blaming an overdeveloped organ of combativeness the way a modern commentator might blame someone's chart or their attachment style. It gives people a vocabulary for character that feels scientific, even when it is doing exactly the same explanatory work as any other folk belief before or since. Fashion even bends around the theory. Hairstyles are sometimes chosen with an eye toward which bumps they conceal or display, and a hat that sits awkwardly might be blamed less on poor tailoring than on an unusually prominent organ of self-esteem underneath. Vanity, ambition and pseudoscience end up tangled together in front of the mirror each morning, which is, if nothing else, a very efficient use of one science. Some employers go further still, having prospective staff or apprentices submit to a head reading before they are hired, on the theory that a suitable temperament for the position can be confirmed by touch before a single day of work has been observed. It is, in effect, a Victorian personality test administered by hand, with a hiring decision riding on the outcome and no appeal process available to the candidate whose skull simply does not read well that afternoon. The theory grows darker at its edges. In some circles, phrenology becomes part of an early and thoroughly unsound argument about criminality. The notion that certain skull types indicate a person predisposed toward crime from birth. An idea that will later be picked up and given a more infamous shape by the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso. A pseudoscience that began by promising to help you pick a spouse ends up, in its uglier corners, being used to suggest that some people are simply built wrong. And yet for a solid stretch of the middle of the century, none of this reads as fringe belief. It is mainstream. It is respectable. It is the kind of thing a sensible, educated person discusses over tea without any sense of embarrassment, in the same tone he might use to discuss a matter of settled fact. It will not last. By the later decades of the Victorian period, phrenology's credibility collapses under the accumulated weight of its own wrong predictions, and it slides steadily from science into curiosity, then from curiosity into punchline. But right now, in this parlour, with a stranger's thumbs pressed into the back of your skull and a ceramic head watching from the counter, none of that decline has happened yet. Right now he is simply reading your future off your scalp, and you are simply paying him to do it. Phrenology rarely travelled alone. It kept close company with a related pseudoscience called physiognomy, which made the parallel claim that your fixed facial features, the shape of your nose, the set of your eyes, the line of your jaw, could reveal your underlying character just as reliably as the bumps on your skull. This meant a Victorian stranger felt entitled to judge you twice over, once by touch, and once simply by looking at your face from across a crowded room. Enterprising publishers were quick to spot a business opportunity here, and they flooded the market with inexpensive home phrenology guides and self-help manuals pitched directly at ordinary households. The promise was simple, with a little home study and a labelled chart for reference. Any person could learn to read the skulls of their own family members without ever paying a professional practitioner a single shilling. What had started as a system requiring trained expertise quickly collapsed into a popular parlour hobby. At its darkest and most clinical extreme, phrenology stopped being a parlour amusement altogether. Certain researchers and prison officials took the logic to its grim conclusion by examining the skulls of executed criminals after death, measuring and cataloguing the bone in search of physical evidence that criminality itself might be written directly into the skeleton of a person before they ever committed a crime. You will leave this appointment with a full character reference, at no cost to your dignity beyond having a stranger handle your skull like a cantaloupe at the market. Descend the narrow back staircase into the working half of the house, because an entire hidden workforce has been awake for hours, and none of them are permitted to be seen doing any of it. By the time you are blinking awake upstairs, wondering vaguely why your room feels pleasantly warm, a housemaid has already been up for hours, having risen around 5 in the morning to lay and light your fire, black your grate, and haul coal up flights of stairs specifically so that the entire operation is finished and invisible before you ever open your eyes. This is the basic contract of the below-stairs world. The labour must happen, and it must appear not to have happened at all, as though warmth and cleanliness simply occur in this house by ambient good fortune. The stairs themselves tell you which half of the house you are in. Upstairs, the treads are carpeted and the walls papered in patterns chosen to impress visitors. Down here, the steps are bare wood, worn smooth and slightly hollowed by decades of hurrying feet, lit by a single candle or a low gas jet, rather than the chandeliers glittering 2 floors above. The temperature drops noticeably as you descend, since heat, like most comforts in this house, has been allocated upward. The air down here carries its own particular signature: coal dust, boot blacking, the tallow smell of cheap candles, and the ever-present tang of scrubbing soda used to keep the stone floors presentable. It is a smell entirely absent from the rooms upstairs, scrubbed away along with every other trace of how the comfort up there gets produced. The household itself runs on a hierarchy as rigid as any regiment. At the top sits the butler, sometimes paired with a housekeeper who governs the female staff and household stores with equal authority. Below them come the footmen, tall and liveried, and often chosen partly for their appearance, followed by the lady's maid attending to her mistress's clothes and hair, the cook ruling the kitchen with an authority nobody dares question, the housemaids doing the unglamorous bulk of the cleaning, a scullery maid scrubbing pots at the very bottom of the indoor ranks, and possibly a hall boy or odd job boy beneath even that, doing whatever nobody else wants to do. Everyone in this chain knows their exact rank, and everyone knows precisely whose orders they answer to and whose they may safely ignore. Footmen occupy a strange position in this hierarchy, valued as much for how they look standing beside a doorway as for what they actually accomplish while standing there. Households have been known to select footmen partly by height and by the shapeliness of their calves in livery stockings, since a matched pair flanking the front door makes a very particular impression on arriving guests. It is possibly the closest the Victorian household comes to hiring purely for aesthetics, dressed up as household management. Communication between the two halves of the house runs through a genuinely ingenious piece of engineering. A board of bells mounted in the servants' quarters, each one wired by cord to a specific room upstairs, so that a single pull on a bell rope in the drawing room sends a specific bell jangling on the board below, telling whichever servant glances up exactly which room requires attention without a single word being exchanged. It is essentially an intercom system, built entirely from wire and gravity, decades before anyone has the vocabulary to call it that, and it lets the family summon assistance without ever having to raise their voice or leave their chair. Even the household's smallest domestic comforts turn out to require quietly heroic effort. Newspapers are ironed before they reach the breakfast table, not for wrinkles but to set the ink and keep it from smudging fashionable fingers. Table settings are arranged with an exactness that would satisfy a geometry teacher, and any dish reaching the dining room must arrive at precisely the correct temperature, despite having travelled from a kitchen that may be an entire floor and several hallways away, carried at a brisk, dignified, entirely silent pace. The deeper rule, though, the one that shapes every movement in this house, is that servants are expected to be functionally invisible while performing their duties. Encounter a footman in the hallway, and he is trained to flatten himself against the wall, eyes down, making himself as small and as unremarkable as a piece of furniture until you have passed. Housemaids time their work specifically to avoid crossing paths with the family at all, cleaning grates and hauling water in the grey hours before anyone upstairs is awake to witness it. The fantasy being maintained here is that the house simply tends itself, that fires light themselves and floors polish themselves, and an enormous amount of coordinated human effort goes into preserving that illusion for people who could presumably survive knowing the truth. Below stairs, though, servants maintain their own compressed version of the household hierarchy, complete with its own etiquette. The butler and housekeeper dine separately from the lower servants, sometimes in a small private room known as the pug's parlour, preserving rank even in the one space in the house where nobody upstairs is watching. It is proof that hierarchy, once thoroughly absorbed, does not simply switch off the moment the family leaves the room. Personal life for these workers is considered a liability to be managed by the employer rather than a private matter belonging to the servant. Female staff are frequently forbidden outright from having romantic partners delicately filed under the heading of followers, and a housemaid discovered entertaining a boyfriend without permission can find herself dismissed on the spot. No warning required. Your employer, in other words, does not simply pay your wages. He also reserves the right to approve your love life, or more accurately, to forbid it entirely. Time off is a scarce and carefully rationed commodity. A servant might expect half a day free each week, and perhaps one full Sunday a month to attend church or visit family. which by modern standards sounds less like a job and more like a long-term residency with occasional supervised leave. Wages are low enough that many servants have essentially no path toward independent security, and the entire arrangement depends on staying in favour with an employer who holds enormous power over your future. That power is concentrated in a single document, the character, a written reference without which no respectable household will hire you at all. An employer displeased with you, for any reason from theft to simply having an opinion, can withhold or damage that reference and effectively end your career in service. There is no appeals board, no third-party mediator, no equivalent of leaving a bad review on the employer instead. There is only the reference, and the employer holds the pen. Stand at the bottom of that back staircase for a moment and consider the sheer choreography required to keep an enormous house running while making the people running it disappear. Fires lit unseen. Coal hauled unseen. Bells answered unseen. An entire staff performing constant, physically demanding labour while being trained, quite literally, to take up as little space and attention as humanly possible. Not every household could afford the small army of specialised servants you have just toured through. Smaller middle-class families instead hired a single maid of all work, sometimes called a tweenie, because she worked in the space between the kitchen and the private rooms of the family upstairs, expected to perform the combined duties that a wealthier house spread comfortably across 5 or 6 separate people, for a correspondingly modest wage. Finding any position in the first place depended heavily on servants' registries. Employment agencies that matched prospective staff with households in need, functioning as a kind of Victorian job placement service, though one where the employer held nearly all the leverage in the transaction, able to reject candidates for reasons as vague as appearance or accent. Presiding conceptually over this entire world of domestic labour was a household manual credited to Mrs. Beeton, titled The Book of Household Management and first published in 1861, which laid out, in exhaustive and thoroughly unforgiving detail, exactly how a well-run household ought to organise its servants, plan its meals, and manage its budget. For the aspiring middle-class mistress determined to run her small below-stairs kingdom with the same rigour as the grandest house in the county, this book became something close to a sacred text. It is, in the end, a house run entirely by people the household has agreed collectively not to notice. Try to court a respectable young woman under these rules, because falling in love in Victorian London comes with more paperwork, supervision, and coded floral vocabulary than most modern people apply to buying a house. Before you exchange a single unsupervised word with her, understand that an unmarried woman of respectable standing is essentially never left alone with a man outside her immediate family. Wherever she goes to meet you, she brings a chaperone, whether that is an aunt, an older family friend, or a servant deputised for the occasion, and that chaperone's job is simply to be present, to witness, to ensure that whatever tender feelings are developing between you develop entirely within eyeshot of a third party. Romance, in other words, happens with an audience. Picture the scene itself. You are seated across the parlour from her, a precise and unbudgeable distance away, while her aunt sits nearby with some needlework, ostensibly absorbed in her stitching, but missing absolutely nothing said between you. The mantel clock ticks with what feels like personal malice. Tea is poured, commented upon, and drunk in a silence occasionally broken by remarks about the weather, because saying anything more interesting risks committing a level of intimacy that requires a different kind of paperwork entirely. Your first move is not a message or a phone call, but a card, deposited at her family's door according to an etiquette so precise it might as well be a legal filing. A visiting card left with a corner turned down is not simply a card with a bent corner, it is a coded transmission. Depending on which corner is folded, you might be signalling that you called in person rather than sending the card by servant, or communicating condolence, congratulation, or farewell. all without writing a single additional word. An entire emotional vocabulary is compressed into the geometry of a folded rectangle of cardstock, and everyone involved is expected to read it fluently. The card itself is a small object carrying a surprising amount of information. Its size, the quality of its stock, and the elegance of its engraving all quietly communicate your social standing before a single word passes between the households. And a servant delivering it on your behalf rather than you presenting it in person sends its own message about how seriously the visit is meant to be taken. Somewhere in all this, a piece of cardstock has become more informative than most modern first dates. Letter-writing manuals of the period devote entire chapters to the correct language for correspondence between a courting couple, spelling out acceptable openings, sanctioned closings, and warnings against anything that might read as overly familiar before an engagement is formally announced. A young woman copying model phrases from such a manual is, in effect, drafting her most private feelings from a template, checked in advance for propriety by an author she has never met, which is either deeply unromantic or the 19th century equivalent of using someone else's suggested reply. Households, for their part, keep specific at-home days, set hours on set days when the family is formally prepared to receive callers and is, by unspoken agreement, unavailable at every other time. Turning up outside those hours is not merely bad manners. It is a small social transgression, the equivalent of showing up to a business meeting that was never scheduled and expecting to be let in anyway. Suppose the card leaving and the chaperoned visits go well, and you would like to declare something more than polite interest. You do not simply say so. You send flowers, because floriography, the language of flowers, is a genuinely widespread code in which the specific bloom you choose says something you are not permitted to say outright. Red tulips announce a declaration of love. A yellow carnation, sent perhaps by a young woman who has thought better of the whole arrangement, communicates rejection or disdain just as clearly as any written note might, only wrapped in ribbon and delivered with a smile. Households keep published dictionaries of flower meanings on hand specifically, so that a bouquet can be decoded like a coded letter, which means your florist's order is, in effect, a legally deniable love letter. The dictionaries of flower meanings run to considerable length, and no small amount of contradiction from one publisher to the next, since floriography was never an official system so much as a loosely shared folk vocabulary, refined and occasionally reinvented by whoever happened to be selling the guidebook that season. Ivy might signal fidelity, a striped carnation might signal refusal, and a sprig of the wrong herb tucked in among an otherwise perfectly innocent bouquet could, in theory, cause a minor domestic crisis. It is entirely possible for a well-meaning suitor to accidentally propose or reject someone through nothing more than an unfortunate florist's substitution. Suppose things progress further still, past the flowers and the calling cards, into an actual formal engagement. This is treated as something close to a binding contract, socially and in certain respects legally. A man who breaks an engagement without what society considers sufficient cause exposes himself to genuine legal risk. A jilted woman can bring what is known as a breach of promise of marriage suit against him, suing for damages in open court, with the details of the courtship potentially aired in front of a judge in a very interested public gallery. Getting cold feet in this era can end with your private life discussed as courtroom evidence. When a breach of promise case does reach the courtroom, it becomes a genuine public spectacle, complete with love letters read aloud for the benefit of the jury and reprinted the next morning in newspapers for the benefit of everyone else. Strangers across the city discuss the intimate details of a courtship that only recently existed entirely within the confines of a chaperoned parlour, which rather defeats the purpose of all that supervision in the first place. The chaperone kept you from stealing a private moment together. The courtroom gallery has no such scruples. Even once engaged, do not expect much relief from supervision. Physical affection between an engaged couple in public remains scandalous. Letters passing between courting couples may be read or at least monitored by family members with an interest in the outcome, and time spent alone indoors together is still restricted regardless of the ring. The entire courtship, from first calling card to wedding day, unfolds under a kind of continuous chaperonage, some of it literal, some of it merely social, all of it constant. Step back and look at the machinery of the whole thing. Cards with coded corners, flowers with coded meanings, chaperones stationed at every private moment, and a legal system standing by to punish anyone who backs out. Where a modern couple might swipe, message and meet for coffee within the space of an afternoon, you are expected to conduct an entire courtship as though it were being reviewed for compliance at every stage. Among the aristocracy, this entire courtship apparatus scaled up into something considerably grander, playing out across what was known as the London season, an annual cycle of balls, dinners and social events during which eligible young women, freshly presented at court as debutantes, were paraded before a carefully vetted pool of eligible bachelors under the watchful supervision of mothers and chaperones who treated the entire enterprise with the seriousness of a military campaign. Flowers, it turns out, were not the only coded accessory available to a Victorian romantic. Fans carried an entire secret vocabulary of their own, and a practiced woman could apparently signal encouragement, indifference, or a firm and final rejection simply through how she held the fan, how quickly she opened it, or which cheek she chose to touch with it. An entire negotiation conducted in fabric and wrist movement without either party risking a single word. Even the engagement ring, once a couple had finally fought its way through flowers, fans and chaperones to secure that formal commitment, arrived wrapped in its own dense layer of etiquette, governing which stones were considered acceptable, the appropriate cost of the ring relative to the giver's income, and the correct occasion on which it ought to be presented. By the time you finally reach the altar, you will have generated more documentation, coded symbolism, and third-party supervision than most people today apply to refinancing a mortgage, and you will still not be entirely sure whether that carnation she sent last week meant yes. Step outside into a fog so thick you cannot see your own outstretched hand. Because London's famous weather is not weather at all, it is a chemical event, and you are standing inside it. What is actually happening around you is ordinary river fog, the kind that rises naturally off the Thames on a cold, still morning, combined with the almost unimaginable volume of coal smoke pouring continuously out of household chimneys, factories and workshops across the entire city. Multiply that smoke by hundreds of thousands of fires burning simultaneously and trap it under damp, windless air, and the result is not mist, it is smog, thick and yellow-green and sulphurous, earning itself the affectionate nickname pea super, as if London had decided its own slow-motion public health emergency deserved a cosy name, the way you might name a hurricane after a relative. You can taste it before you can properly see it, a scratch at the back of the throat and a faint metallic tang that clings to your tongue. It presses into your clothes, your hair, the lining of your nose, coating everything with the same fine grit that already blackens the buildings around you. Breathing normally requires a kind of active effort you did not previously associate with simply standing outside. The fog does not have the courtesy to stay outdoors either. It seeps in under doors and through window frames, filling entire rooms with a thin haze that makes gaslight burn with a strange, smudged halo in the middle of the afternoon. Households light their lamps at midday as though it were dusk, and the air indoors carries the same faint, sulphurous edge as the street outside, just slightly diluted. Visibility in the worst of these fogs drops to a matter of feet, which turns the ordinary business of walking down the street into something closer to a hazard course. Carriages appear out of the murk with no warning at all. Open pits from ongoing roadworks become genuinely dangerous. The Thames itself, unmarked and unlit in the gloom, becomes something a disoriented pedestrian could conceivably walk straight into. Which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Londoners take fog navigation as a survival skill rather than an inconvenience. Enterprising individuals known as link boys or fogmen solve this problem the way any sensible city dweller solves a persistent local hazard, by charging for a solution. Carrying torches or lanterns, they guide pedestrians through the worst of the murk for a fee, walking ahead of you like a small, flickering lighthouse, escorting you from one side of a fog-bound street to the other in exchange for a coin. It is essentially a taxi service built entirely around the fact that the city's air has briefly become unnavigable, and business is presumably excellent on the worst days. Street lamps, ordinarily reserved for after dark, stay lit around the clock during the worst episodes, casting a dim, useless glow that does little more than mark their own location in the gloom. Horses grow skittish in conditions this disorienting, spooked by shapes looming suddenly out of nothing, and drivers learn to speak to their animals constantly, in a low, steady voice, simply to keep them calm enough to continue moving forward at all. These fogs are not brief inconveniences either. A bad one can settle over the city for several days running, thick enough that entire stretches of daylight simply do not arrive, and the population adjusts to conducting ordinary business by lamplight at what the calendar insists is midday. It becomes less an unusual event than an extended communal endurance exercise, one the entire city has simply learned to wait out. Public transport does not fare much better. Trains crawl through the murk at reduced speed, and omnibus drivers, unable to see more than a few feet past their own horses, sometimes resort to walking alongside the animals rather than trusting them to find the way by instinct alone. A journey that ordinarily takes 20 minutes can stretch into hours, and more than one traveller simply gives up and waits out the worst of it in whatever doorway happens to be nearby. The health toll behind this quaint nickname is genuinely severe. Breathing concentrated coal smoke for hours or days at a stretch takes a measurable toll on human lungs, and mortality during the worst fog events rises sharply, falling hardest on the very young, the elderly, and anyone already struggling with a respiratory illness. In 1873, one particularly severe fog event is followed by several hundred additional deaths across the city, a grim preview, on a smaller scale, of the far more infamous Great Smog that will settle over London decades into the next century. Nobody at the time is describing this in the language of a public health crisis. It is simply spoken of as very bad weather this week. Writers of the period reach for the fog constantly as a kind of shorthand for London itself, describing it in shades from pale grey to a deep bilious yellow thick enough to seem almost solid, as though the city had been sealed inside a jar. That the fog becomes such reliable literary material tells you how thoroughly it had woven itself into the ordinary texture of daily life here. Less an occasional weather event than a recurring character in the city's own story. The soot from all this does not politely disappear once the fog lifts. It settles permanently onto buildings, monuments and statues, staining the stone the deep grey-black you have probably been quietly assuming is just the natural colour of old London architecture. Snow itself falls dirty, turning grey within hours of landing, less a soft blanket over the city than a fresh surface for the soot to redecorate. Keeping any building's exterior looking presentable requires constant, repeated cleaning, an endless losing battle against a sky that never really stops raining coal. Laundry suffers along with everything else. White collars and cuffs turn grey within hours of being worn outdoors, and households budget for far more frequent washing than would otherwise be necessary, since simply existing outside for an afternoon is enough to visibly dirty an entire outfit. Keeping up appearances in every sense becomes a genuinely expensive and time-consuming task purely because of what is hanging in the air. Remarkably, this same fog becomes a subject of genuine artistic fascination rather than pure horror. The French painter Claude Monet, visiting London, becomes captivated by the strange filtered light the fog throws across the Thames and its bridges, producing a celebrated series of paintings that render the smog in shades of violet, orange and gold, transforming a choking industrial hazard into something that hangs, quite literally, in art galleries as a thing of beauty. It is possible to find a phenomenon simultaneously breathtaking and lethal, and Victorian London appears to have managed both reactions at once, without much sense of contradiction. Criminals, ever practical, treated the fog less as a nuisance and more as a professional advantage. A properly thick pea souper provided excellent cover for burglary and pickpocketing, letting a thief work a crowd or a window latch with far less risk of being seen, then simply vanish down a side street before a pursuing constable could get a clear look at anything at all beyond a vague shape disappearing into yellow murk. Out on the water, the same blinding conditions produced genuine disasters rather than mere inconvenience. Barges, steamers and other river traffic collided in the gloom of the Thames with an unsettling regularity during the worst fog events, since a river as crowded with commercial shipping as the Thames does not simply stop moving just because nobody aboard can see where they are going. The fog even worked its way into the literature of the era as something close to a character in its own right. Charles Dickens opened one of his novels with a description of fog creeping into absolutely every corner of the city, drifting up the river and down the river, settling into the eyes and throats of old and young alike. A passage so vivid and so widely read across the country that it helped cement the pea souper permanently into the popular imagination as the defining texture of Victorian London. River traffic during the thickest fogs relied on sound rather than sight to avoid disaster, with steamers and barges sounding fog signal horns and small warning guns at regular intervals. A mournful, repeating chorus echoing off buildings on either bank that told sailors roughly where the nearest vessel might be, without ever letting them actually see it. Standing on a bridge in weather like this, surrounded by nothing but yellow murk and the muffled bark of distant horns, you would be forgiven for thinking the entire city had been swallowed whole, which, functionally, for a day or two at a stretch, it rather had been. Consider, as you stand coughing gently in the murk, that the city around you has essentially agreed to treat an ongoing air quality emergency as a beloved local eccentric, complete with a nickname, a devoted following of painters, and absolutely no plan whatsoever to make it stop. Feel a cough coming on, and the chemist's shelf offers you dozens of confident, colourfully labelled solutions, nearly all of which are doing considerably less than they claim, and rather more than they admit. The shelf itself is a marvel of Victorian confidence, rows of embossed glass bottles with gold lettering and a testimonial or two printed right there on the label, as though the bottle itself were vouching for its own character. Newspapers of the period are stuffed with full-page advertisements promising, from a single small bottle, relief from consumption, nerves, female complaints, liver troubles, and general debility, which is a fairly impressive list of ailments for something that fits in a coat pocket. There is no government body checking any of this. No one is required to print what is actually inside, in what quantity, or what it might do to you after the third dose. You are, in effect, buying medicine on the strength of a slogan and a confident moustache on the label. Take Beecham's pills, arguably the most successful of the lot, marketed as a cure for practically everything that could trouble a Victorian body. The actual contents are aloe, ginger and soap, which is to say you are being sold a mild laxative dressed up as a miracle, the 19th century equivalent of a fibre gummy claiming to fix your marriage. And yet the advertising campaign behind it is genuinely enormous, plastered across billboards and newspapers with a persistence that would make a modern infomercial blush, because it turns out that a product does not need to work wonders if it is marketed as though it already has. Then there is Dr. J. Collis Brown's Chloridine, which is a different case entirely, because this one actually works, in the sense that matters to a suffering Victorian. It is a mixture that includes opium or morphine, a tincture of cannabis and chloroform, sold as a treatment for cholera, diarrhea, coughs and pain in general, and it is trusted precisely because it does something, unlike the soap pills. Of course it soothes your cough. It would soothe a cough, a headache, a bad marriage, and mild existential dread, because you have essentially been handed a shot of assorted sedatives and told it is for your chest. You feel remarkably at peace about the whole situation, which is exactly the point. For those with slightly more continental tastes, there is Vin Mariani, a wine infused with coca leaf, popular across Europe including Britain and marketed as a restorative tonic, endorsed by a parade of prominent public figures whose enthusiasm reads suspiciously like the world's earliest celebrity sponsorship deal. You drink a glass, you feel wonderful, you assume it is the fine vintage. It is not entirely the vintage. None of this requires anyone to disclose what is actually in the bottle. There is no ingredient list, no dosage warning, no regulatory body cross-checking the claims against reality, which means the entire system runs on testimonials and nerve. The Victorian equivalent of trusting a 5-star review from an account with no other activity. A confident label and a well-placed quote from a satisfied customer, real or invented, is doing the work that a natural clinical trial would do today. Which is why, when coroners and later chemists actually bothered to analyse some of these celebrated tonics, the results were often anticlimactic in the extreme. Alcohol, sugar syrup and water, dressed up with an impressive name and a stern-looking gentleman on the label. You have, in many cases, paid a considerable sum for flavoured water with excellent branding. This is not a moral failing on your part. This is simply what happens in a market with no rules and an unlimited supply of confident adjectives. The showmanship is really the whole product. Travelling salesmen roll into town with cases of tonics and a speech polished to a shine, promising vitality restored and ailments banished, and the bottle itself is engraved and dignified enough to suggest serious pharmaceutical science, rather than a fellow with a cart and a good speaking voice. It is, in spirit, not so different from a modern wellness aisle promising that a powder will detoxify your liver, except the Victorian version occasionally also gets you pleasantly sedated. And that really is the quiet secret behind the whole industry. A good number of these products do work, in the sense of making you feel distinctly better, for the entirely unsubtle reason that they are 1/3 opium. You are not cured. You are, however, wonderfully unbothered by not being cured, which from where you are lying feels like much the same thing. Not every remedy on offer required you to swallow anything at all. Somewhere in the same shop window as the tonics, you will find a curious rubber and metal contraption sold as an electric belt, meant to be strapped directly against the skin, night after night, where it delivers a charge so faint you would struggle to prove it existed at all, let alone that it was doing anything to your nervous exhaustion or your general debility. Then there are the pills built for an ailment so vague it could belong to almost anyone. Carter's little liver pills made a small fortune diagnosing the entire population with a sluggish liver and a bilious complaint, conditions broad enough that on any given evening, after any given supper, you could probably talk yourself into believing you had one. And behind every bottle sits a wall of glowing letters, printed in full, from customers who insist their health was transformed. You have no way of checking whether the person who wrote it exists, works for the company, or was invented entirely at a writing desk by the same men who designed the label. You go back for another bottle next week, of course, because it worked so well the first time, and you do not think very hard about why. Neither, for the most part, did anyone else in London. Receive an insult serious enough to demand satisfaction, because even as the century wears on, a small, stubborn slice of English society still believes the correct response to a rude comment is a loaded pistol at dawn. The whole affair is, on paper, illegal. Duelling has been against the law in Britain for a very long time, and yet for a while a certain set of gentry and military men treat that fact, with the same polite disregard they might show a strongly worded letter from an aunt. What makes it stranger still is that this is not a spontaneous burst of rage, a shove in a tavern, a shouted challenge in the heat of the moment. It is bureaucracy. Genuine, itemised procedural bureaucracy applied to the act of trying to shoot another gentleman. There is an entire informal rulebook for this, sometimes called the Code Duello, and it reads like the world's most elaborate customer complaints process. An insult must be answered with a formal demand for satisfaction, delivered through proper channels, because apparently even a mortal grudge requires the right paperwork. Each party appoints a second, a sort of designated representative whose job is to negotiate terms on your behalf, and in a detail that undercuts the entire enterprise rather beautifully, to try to talk both sides out of it if at all possible. You have hired a man specifically to attempt to prevent the thing you are both there to do. If the seconds fail to broker peace, weapons are selected, and by the Victorian period this generally means pistols, sold and kept as matched pairs in fitted wooden cases lined with velvet, occasionally passed down through a family like a set of good silver, except this silver is for shooting your neighbour over a perceived slight to your character. There is something almost tender about the craftsmanship involved in an object built for a purpose this petty. The ritual itself is choreographed down to the footstep. Distances are paced out with exact precision, positions are assigned, and the whole thing proceeds on command, as though grievous bodily harm were a form of country dancing. Everyone involved behaves with immaculate manners throughout. You bow, you take your mark, you very possibly get shot, all while maintaining the composure of a man attending a garden party. By the 1840s and 1850s, this stately nonsense starts to look increasingly out of step with the age. Legal prosecutions of duellists become more common, which has a wonderfully clarifying effect on enthusiasm for the practice. Military authorities formally discourage duelling within their own regulations around 1844, meaning the very institution that once quietly winked at the custom now officially frowns upon it, at least on paper. At the same time, a rising and increasingly powerful middle class starts looking at the whole tradition with an expression somewhere between confusion and mild embarrassment. To this newer, more respectable sensibility, standing in a field at dawn to be shot at over a comment made at dinner does not read as honourable. It reads as reckless, aristocratic, and more than a little silly. The 19th century equivalent of settling a workplace dispute with a sword fight in the car park. One of the last duelling deaths connected with English soil is generally traced to 1852, and rather tellingly, it involves two Frenchmen fighting on English ground, as though the practice itself has become an imported curiosity by that point, something England watches with polite detachment rather than something it still actively does. The home team, so to speak, has largely moved on. By the height of the Victorian era, the duel has become something between a fading aristocratic relic and outright social embarrassment. The correct venue for settling a dispute over honour is now widely understood to be a courtroom, a strongly worded letter, or simply enduring the insult with the tight-lipped dignity of a man who has decided this particular hill is not worth dying on. Look closely at the pistols themselves and you will notice they are, frankly, gorgeous, made by gunsmiths whose names alone commanded real prestige among collectors. A good duelling pair could be balanced like a fine instrument and engraved with the sort of care usually reserved for jewellery, which makes for an unsettling combination once you remember their entire stated purpose was the orderly. Killing of a dinner guest who had insulted you at cards. The Church of England, to its credit, never pretended to find any of this dignified. Clergymen condemned duelling from the pulpit as attempted murder wearing a waistcoat, plainly and repeatedly, for generations. It made almost no difference. Matters of honour were apparently filed under a completely separate moral heading from matters of Sunday observance. Even in 1837, When a young queen first took the throne, the whole practice already smelled faintly of an older, fading world, one where public men a generation earlier had settled arguments at 20 paces as a matter of course. The society she now presided over was only just beginning, grudgingly, to talk itself out of the habit. There is a certain dark comedy in watching an entire class of Englishmen slowly realise, decade by decade, that shooting your acquaintances over rudeness was perhaps never as dignified as the velvet-lined pistol case made it look. You keep the pistols anyway. They look wonderful on the wall, and nobody has to know they were ever loaded in anger. Consider, for a moment, how long it has actually been since you had a proper wash. Because for the overwhelming majority of Victorian London, the honest answer is longer than you would like to admit. This is not laziness, it is logistics. A full bath, for most of the century, is not a matter of turning a tap and waiting, because for the majority of homes, there is no tap to turn in that sense at all. Piped hot water and a dedicated bathroom only start appearing in wealthier households from roughly the 1870s or 1880s onward, and even then it is far from universal, a luxury rather than a baseline expectation. For everyone else, bathing means dragging out a portable tin hip bath, setting it in front of the kitchen or bedroom fire for warmth and modesty combined, and filling it kettle by kettle with water heated on the stove. You can imagine the arithmetic here. Heating enough water for a proper soak takes time, fuel and effort, all of which are in shorter supply than you might wish after a full day of work. Unsurprisingly, a full wash becomes a weekly event for many households, sometimes less frequent than that, with the gaps filled in by quicker partial washes of the hands, face and other essential areas using nothing more than a basin and a cloth. You are, in effect, doing spot maintenance rather than a full service. The social awareness of this gap is not subtle, either. The phrase "the great unwashed," used with considerable condescension to describe the lower classes, was coined by the novelist and politician Edward Bulwer Lytton, which tells you that hygiene disparity was not some private embarrassment, but a matter of open, casual public commentary, tossed around rather the way modern commentary might sneer at someone's postcode. Soap does not help matters, at least not at first, because for a long stretch of British history it was taxed, which kept it comparatively expensive and out of easy reach for poorer households. The tax was finally repealed in 1853, after which soap becomes somewhat more affordable, though it remains something used sparingly and with intention rather than lathered on with any modern abandon. You do not waste a resource you had to budget for. As if the practical barriers were not enough, some physicians of the era actively caution against bathing too often, warning that frequent washing might weaken the constitution or strip away the body's natural protective oils. This is, in effect, a doctor's note excusing you from a task you were already inclined to skip. And you can imagine how gratefully that advice was received by anyone already daunted by the kettle hauling involved. There is at least some official acknowledgement of the problem. Public bathhouses and washhouses, established under legislation such as the Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846, offer working people facilities they lack at home, a sort of municipal admission that private bathing arrangements simply are not keeping pace with the population crowded into the city. The result of all this is not a city divided neatly into the clean and the unclean, but rather a city floating somewhere in the collective middle, and that collective middle is precisely why nobody much minds. When everyone, from the scullery maid to a fair number of the aristocracy, exists somewhere on the same broad spectrum of not quite clean, the whole thing becomes a kind of shared ambient condition, rather than a personal failing to remark upon, not unlike how nobody comments on the smell of a train carriage, because everyone on it is equally responsible. Coal smoke does its own work here too, settling over the entire city in a way that means fresh air itself carries a faint char, so that even a recently washed person exists inside an atmosphere that is not exactly pristine to begin with. You could scrub for an hour and still walk outside into a haze that undoes half the effort within minutes. The wealthy, for their part, are not actually so far removed from this reality as their finer clothes might suggest. They simply have better tools for disguising it, heavier perfumes, more frequent changes of linen, powdered wigs and scented handkerchiefs standing in for the plumbing nobody yet has. Rich or poor, you are all, in your own way, working around the same basic absence of a hot shower. If you had money and a certain interest in your own constitution, the 1850s offered you something genuinely new. The Turkish bath, brought to Britain and championed by men like David Urquhart, a whole ritual of steam rooms and dry heat and communal soaking that bore no resemblance whatsoever to crouching in a tin-hip bath in front of the fire. For a few hours you could sit in warm fog with other similarly damp gentlemen, sweating out whatever the era believed needed sweating out, in something approaching an actual spa experience. Boys sent away to boarding school received the opposite philosophy entirely. Cold water, delivered briskly and without apology, was considered character building, the theory being that discomfort in the morning produced discipline and manliness by the afternoon. So even in households that could easily have afforded hot water and privacy, plenty of young gentlemen were deliberately plunged into cold basins anyway, on the grounds that being comfortable while getting clean was itself a kind of moral failing that needed correcting early. Rich or poor, steamed or shivering, the underlying arrangement never really changed. Cleanliness was talked about constantly, praised endlessly, held up as proof of good character, and achieved by almost nobody with any real consistency. You settle back into bed reasonably certain that whatever you can currently smell on yourself is, at minimum, not remarkable by local standards, which is, in Victorian London, as close to fresh as anyone gets. Fill a glass from the household pump, because that water, drawn from a well or a river that has been sharing space with the city's waste for decades, may be about to make you extremely, dangerously ill. London in this period suffers cholera epidemics with grim regularity, notably in 1832, 1849, 1854 and 1866. And each one kills thousands. This is not a single catastrophe you can point to and say there, that was the bad one. It is a recurring feature of city life, arriving every so often like a particularly lethal season, and for a long stretch of the century, nobody is entirely sure why it keeps happening. The dominant theory for much of this time is miasma, the idea that disease spreads through bad air, foul smells rising from filth and rot. It is a theory that feels intuitively correct, given how much of Victorian London genuinely does smell terrible, but it is also, crucially, wrong, and clinging to it costs a great many lives while the actual culprit sits quietly in the water supply. The physician John Snow changes this, at least eventually, during a severe 1854 outbreak centred on Broad Street in Soho. By meticulously mapping where cases were occurring, Snow traces the outbreak to a single contaminated public water pump and has its handle removed, a small, almost absurdly modest gesture that nonetheless demonstrates, with startling clarity, that cholera travels through water rather than air. It is one of the founding moments of epidemiology as a discipline. It is also, tellingly, not immediately believed. Years pass before the wider medical establishment fully accepts that Snow was right and the prevailing miasma theory was not, which means plenty of people keep drinking from questionable sources long after the answer was, quite literally, staring at them from a pump handle. Part of the problem is structural, and it is a genuinely unsettling piece of structural failure. Several private water companies draw London's drinking water directly from stretches of the Thames that are at the very same time receiving the city's sewage discharge. You are, without knowing it, drinking from the same river that is currently disposing of everything the city no longer wants. Areas served by cleaner upstream sources or better filtration have noticeably lower death rates than those drawing from the more contaminated stretches, which in hindsight looks like a fairly clear experiment in public health, conducted, unfortunately, on an entire population that did not consent to participate. Nobody is safe from this simply by virtue of rank. Prince Albert, husband to Queen Victoria, dies in 1861 of what is diagnosed as typhoid fever, and some historical accounts connect the illness to poor drainage and sanitation conditions at Windsor Castle itself. If the sanitation infrastructure of a royal residence is not immune to this problem, it is difficult to imagine what chance the rest of the city stood. It takes until 1883, when the German scientist Robert Koch definitively identifies the bacterium responsible for cholera, for the germ theory understanding of these diseases to become scientifically conclusive rather than merely a strong suspicion advanced by one persistent doctor with a map. By that point, London's new sewer system, engineered under Basil Jett, has already been quietly reducing outbreaks for years, for reasons that were, at the time, more practical than fully understood. The city gets healthier before it fully understands why, rather like taking medicine that works without reading the label. There is something genuinely eerie about sitting with this fact for a moment. An entire city drinking, cooking and washing with water that was, in a very literal sense, mixed with its own waste, while its residents fell dangerously ill again and again without a clear picture of why. You would think the smell alone might have been a clue, but then again, this is a city where the ambient smell is already so overwhelming that one more foul note barely registers as noteworthy. Street sellers hawking water to the poor had their own trick for moving stock nobody would otherwise want. A pinch of alum stirred into a cloudy, questionable bucketful could clear it right up, at least to the eye, turning something murky and suspect into something that looked, at a glance, perfectly drinkable. It did nothing whatsoever about what was actually still in the water. One of the strangest clues supporting Jon Snow's suspicion that water, not bad air, was spreading cholera came from a brewery near the infamous Broad Street pump. Its workers stayed almost entirely healthy while the neighbourhood around them fell ill, for the simple reason that their daily allowance of beer meant they were barely drinking any water at all, contaminated or otherwise. It is tempting to laugh at how long miasma theory hung on, but the truth is it fit the evidence reasonably well for decades. Disease really did cluster wherever the smell was worst, and separating cause from mere coincidence, with the instruments available then, was a genuinely hard problem, not simple foolishness. The press personified the whole crisis as a recurring villain, and newspaper cartoons of the era regularly depicted King Cholera as a grinning, skeletal monarch presiding over the slums, crowned and robed in filth, stalking through overcrowded courts and allies the official reports politely called insanitary. It was a piece of dark theatre that turned an invisible, poorly understood killer into something a reader could at least picture and rage against, even before anyone fully understood what was actually filling their water glass. You raise your glass, take a sip, and try very hard not to think about where the river has recently been. Take a seat at the darkened parlour table, place your hands flat upon it, and prepare to speak with the dead, because for a remarkable slice of Victorian society, from the scullery maid to the Queen herself, this counts as a perfectly ordinary evening in. The whole craze arrives from America, traced back to the Fox sisters and their claimed spirit rapping beginning in 1848, and it crosses the Atlantic with remarkable speed, taking hold across British society through the 1850s and 60s in a way that cuts cleanly across class lines. This is not confined to dim back rooms and disreputable corners. It settles comfortably into servants' quarters and aristocratic drawing rooms alike, which means on any given evening a duchess and her housemaid might, quite separately, be doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same sincerity. Table turning and rapping parties become the centrepiece of this fashion, a group gathered around a table, hands resting lightly on its surface, waiting for a tilt, a rap, a shudder that can be interpreted as a message from beyond. This is not treated as a fringe or shameful activity. It is a genuinely respectable parlour pastime, slotted into the evening the way a modern household might slot in a board game, except the stated objective is contacting someone who has died rather than acquiring hotels on a coloured board. Some mediums become, in the fullest sense, celebrities. Daniel Douglas Home is the most famous of these, known for claimed feats including levitation, and he is investigated repeatedly by serious scientists of the day without ever being definitively caught cheating, which sets him apart from a long list of lesser mediums exposed, using tricks as unglamorous as hidden fishing line, sliding panels, and conveniently placed accomplices. You sit across the table from a man who may or may not be about to float toward the ceiling, and the fact that nobody can quite prove otherwise is, in its own way, the whole appeal. There are tools for this too, most notably the planchette, a small heart-shaped board on wheels holding a pencil, used for what is called automatic writing. The idea being that a spirit might guide the medium's hand to produce a message. It is the direct ancestor of the modern Ouija board, which is itself patented in America in 1890, meaning the parlour game you might recognise from a sleepover has a fairly direct lineage running straight back through this exact drawing room habit. None of this makes much sense until you consider the sheer scale of loss that defines this period. Infant mortality is staggering. Disease and childbirth complications carry off loved ones with a regularity that would be unthinkable by later standards. And Victorian culture has already built an elaborate architecture of mourning around this fact, from strict mourning dress to jewellery woven from the hair of the deceased. Seen against that backdrop, the desire to sit at a table and reach, however implausibly, towards someone you have lost stops looking like superstition and starts looking like something closer to grief with a ritual attached. Queen Victoria herself is reported to have sought contact with the spirit of Prince Albert through mediums during her long widowhood, which tells you a great deal about how far up the social ladder this impulse reaches. If the most powerful woman in the empire is willing to sit quietly in a darkened room, hoping for a sign from her late husband, it becomes rather difficult to dismiss the whole enterprise as something only credulous servants indulge in. The scientific establishment does not entirely ignore any of this either. The Society for Psychical Research is founded in 1882 specifically to investigate spiritualist claims with something resembling rigour, and while its conclusions lean heavily sceptical, the fact that serious, credentialed people devote real effort to testing whether any of it holds up says a great deal about how mainstream the question had become. This is not a fringe curiosity being humoured. It is a genuine subject of inquiry, conducted with the same straight-faced seriousness you might expect applied to any other unresolved scientific question of the age. What is perhaps strangest of all, looking back, is how unremarkable the whole practice felt at the time. Nobody hosting a séance considers themselves to be doing anything occult or disreputable. It is simply what a certain kind of respectable evening looks like. Hands on the table, curtains drawn, a slightly nervous silence, and the shared hope that something on the other side might answer back. Scepticism did occasionally win, though usually far too late to matter. The Fox sisters, generally credited with starting the whole spiritualist craze, eventually admitted in 1888, decades after they began, that their famous spirit rappings had been produced by nothing more supernatural than cracking their own toe joints under the table. By then the movement had already crossed 2 continents and settled into the imaginations of millions of grieving people. Alongside the rapping and the table turning grew an equally profitable sideline in spirit photography, in which a photographer used simple double exposure to produce a faint, ghostly extra figure hovering behind an ordinary sitter, sold to bereaved families as literal photographic proof that a departed husband or child lingered nearby. Even serious men joined the investigation. The chemist William Crookes spent considerable time studying well-known mediums under controlled conditions, and occasionally reported results he could not immediately explain, which satisfied no one, and simply kept both sides of the argument, genuine phenomenon or elaborate rehearsed theatre, arguing, you blow out the candle afterward, quite unsure whether anything in the room actually heard you, and go to bed regardless, because in Victorian London, that uncertainty was never quite enough to cancel the evening. And there you have it. A full tour of a city that painted its walls with poison, fed its babies opium, photographed its dead, and called every bit of it Tuesday. It is easy, from the comfort of your actual bed, in your actual clean water, breathing your actual unpoisoned air, to laugh at Victorian London, and you should a little, because so much of it really is absurd. A duel over a rude comment. A wallpaper committee deciding your parlour should also be a slow poisoning, a séance as a perfectly normal Tuesday evening in. But underneath the arsenic and the gin and the fog thick enough to chew, there is something else worth carrying with you into sleep tonight, which is simply how much these people endured, quietly, without complaint, because complaining was a luxury nobody had time to afford. They raised children in nurseries that smelled of coal smoke and treacle. They dressed for work in the dark, laced each other into impossible garments, carried water up flights of stairs before dawn, and somehow still found room for flowers with secret meanings and evenings spent trying to talk to people they had lost. They built, out of soot and sewage and sheer bloody-minded persistence, the sewers and hospitals and reforms that would eventually make your life immeasurably easier, even if they themselves never lived to enjoy any of it. So when you turn off your light tonight, in a room with no wallpaper trying to kill you, no chamber pot waiting under the bed, no fog pressing against the window, let that be its own quiet kind of gratitude. You do not have to fetch your own bathwater. You do not have to wonder what is actually in your tea. You are, by comparison, living in almost unreasonable luxury, and you did not even have to fight a duel for it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If you made it this far still awake, that is genuinely impressive. And if you did not, well, that was rather the point. Sleep well, wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is for you. Victorian London is done being weird at you for one night. Good night.